Chapter 281 By the Grace of God. Marcus POV. The insects had nothing on the blight-touched orcs. Oh, they were deadly, quick, persistent, and all around not a fun time, but they weren't endless like the orcs were. They also had the option to retreat when facing the bugs that they didn't have now. They'd either win or lose a battle relatively quickly versus the swarm. Not this drawn-out battle ticking up there in hours. It had been at least 4 by now. That was insane. Mana dried up. Anchors ran dry. Stamina bottomed out. Yet the orcs were still coming. Marcus had thought at first the test wouldn't be so bad. Sure, the orcs were level 100, but they weren't that hard to kill. The champions had some extra oomph, but they weren't that hard. The chieftains took a regular team working together to take down. But it wasn't. That all went out the window in the face of the tide. The tide of battle had started at their back. High and mighty they were, but slowly, ever so slowly, the tide had shifted. Marcus had felt it. With every death, with every spell draining the last of a mage's mana, with every warrior collapsing having swung his last. It was a battle of attrition and they were losing. Marcus himself nearly lost. His glaive was visibly rusted from the mistake of leaving blood on its surface, and the waters raging around him were tainted black from orc blood. He did his best to, but he could only do so much. He nearly collapsed in euphoria when he felt the tides shifting. Instead of slowly being lost to the other side, they started to come back. A few drops of water at first, nearly imperceptible to his senses. Then the flow intensified. Then it grew even more. The feeling caught him so off guard that Marcus nearly lost an arm trying to find out the reason. It wasn't until the chieftains around him thinned that he realized. The orcs were slowing down. The wave was ending. The horde had run dry. Then they came. All the momentum they had built up. The tide that had finally started to swing back in their direction was lost. Ripped away just as all sound was ripped away by the earth-shaking roars. Marcus felt the war leader coming for him. It was impossible not to. The vicious aura blanketed the area, causing some to back away in fear. All 4 directions had an enemy to deal with. There would be no help coming. It was up to him and Chris, who he hadn't seen hide nor tail of in hours. Marcus solemnly wished the man wasn't dead. He wasn't sure he could beat the war leader alone. Scratch that, he was sure he couldn't beat the war leader alone. Not as tired and drained as he was. If he was in prime condition, maybe, but he was far from being in prime condition. Everyone was. Unless they sat back and did nothing for hours, everyone was running dry. His mana pool, severely enhanced by his new mana cultivation, was running on empty, let alone the people who didn't even make that step yet. As the chieftains thinned and their reckoning came ever closer, he finally had the mental capacity to weigh his options. He could run. Nothing said he had to die in an unwinnable battle. He turned back and gazed over his people behind him, the little that were left. He prayed that the makeshift first aid tents were so overrun, that 7 more were hastily constructed and that was where everyone was, but he couldn't delude himself. There were enough lifeless eyes peering back at him to know where most of his people were, and it wasn't in hospitals. No, it wasn't vengeance that rushed through him. The sight of so many of his people dead angered him. Sure, but he didn't turn back to the war leader with vengeance in his heart. It was resolve. Everyone was tired. The hospitals had to be overflowing with less than he hoped, but enough that moving them would be impossible. If he didn't step up and face the powerful orc, it would kill everyone here. He had to do his duty whether he wanted to or not. The only good thing was he had time to catch his breath. No Man's Land, as Marcus called it, was awash with craters, pockmarks of various sizes, raging fires and man-made ponds. The environment was so thoroughly destroyed that getting through it was a challenge in its own right. The rain and blood-soaked ground stuck and slowed down those charging through it. The rents from battle forced detours. The siege weapon craters turned murky swimming pools had to be avoided. He had time to lean on his glaive and gather what he could. The din of battle had rushed by him and left his ears struggling to recover. They only picked up the rumbling thunder overhead or the sharp crack of distant lightning. He hadn't realized there was a gap, but he was grateful for it. The walking disaster closed in which forced his tired, aching legs to move. Against all self-preservation instincts, he walked toward the domineering aura. Far to his left, he felt another following in his footsteps. Last he heard, the Great Lakes Alliance was stationed over there, but he didn't much care about that at this point. Not now. Marcus noticed that his path was taking him toward where Chris once stood. He'd felt the frigid Arctic earlier in the battle from the area, but it had been drowned out as the fight intensified. Slush coated the land. Blackened and dirty shards of ice half-melted crunched underfoot as he walked. Lakes turned half-frozen and a light dusting of snow coated the land. It was far from the pristine white that a fresh snowfall created. Instead, a gray and black that made it look closer to ash than fresh snow. The snow was the least interesting. It was the bodies. Thousands of bodies. Some were only parts of bodies, the rest lost somewhere or crushed into nothingness. Body after body blanketed the land, and he began to walk on them instead of the ground itself. If there was an idea in his mind of being able to win against Chris, it was crushed now. Thoroughly the supremely. Marcus. A voice surprised him, and he turned to see someone he hadn't expected. Not out here in no man's land, at least. Her hair floated limply in the air and was more mud than hair at this point. She limped forward on her staff at nearly the same pace as himself. "Abigail," he responded. "It's good to see you aren't dead." He hadn't felt her approach, and it wasn't because she was being stealthy. The overabundance of water mana in the air naturally hid her own, but there was barely enough of it left to be noticeable. Her core was petering on fumes, trying its best to replenish itself with the mana in the air. "Have you seen Chris?" she asked, laced with dread. It wasn't hard to hear the worry in her voice. Marcus shook his head. "No, only his handiwork." He motioned at all the bodies and ice. "Is anyone else coming?" The war leader, while slowed by the terrain, was still closing in. He didn't know all of their family, but he knew they were powerful. He'd fought with Austin before and was surprised to not see him swaggering up to help. He saw and felt only Abigail. "No," she breathed sadly. Austin collapsed when the orc stopped. "Healers are looking at him, but he won't be here for that." Her hand listlessly waved in the direction of what was coming. "Everyone else is either dead or collapsed." Her voice was emotionless. Too far gone to care, and that was saying something. The woman who had talked his ear off about those she cared about couldn't muster up the words. She spoke of dead family members like it was the weather. "Your husband?" Marcus questioned and hoped. He'd met the man before and had grown to like him. "Alive," she answered firmly. "I made sure of it." They'd stopped to talk and recover, which allowed the presence he felt trailing him to catch up. Both turned to take in the newcomer. Or newcomers, he should say. "Is this it?" The newcomer voiced tiredly. "The 5 of us against that." The speaker was a man Marcus barely recognized. The older gentleman from the meeting looked war-torn and covered in muck, blood, and other viscera. Patrick Stafford's, if he remembered correctly, leader of the Great Lakes Alliance. At his back were 2 others, both with wild flaring auras that were nearly a match for Marcus's own. Patrick carried an axe in either hand, while the 2 behind him, a man and a woman, both carried staves. The thin covering of water was the only thing keeping the axes free of the corrosive blood, the same trick Marcus used with his glaive. He'd learned quickly his weapon would be lost if he didn't cover it. A group of 5 from all over the land stood together. It was poetic in a way Marcus dismissed as irrelevant. 6, the woman interrupted. "There's another further ahead." "Further ahead?" Patrick asked incredulously. "What madman would be that deep?" "Chris still lives." A weight slightly lifted hearing that, and he wasn't the only one to feel it. Abigail's relief was audible at hearing there was another person further ahead. A hammer clanged in his mind, and he gathered his wits. Now wasn't the time for this. "You and I are the front line. The man up ahead is also a warrior, so he will be the 3rd. He gestured to Patrick and himself. "You 3 will be the back line. I'm assuming you 2 are mages." He pointed at the 2 behind Patrick. The aura was nearing, and all of them felt it. They knew there wasn't time to discuss anything more than that, and grimly nodded. It wasn't until the woman spoke again that his plans started falling apart. The man isn't retreating. There wasn't any worry or fear in her voice. Only a statement of fact. Apathy after seeing so many die. Chris, you fool. Does he think he can face it alone? After all this? If Abigail had more strength in her legs, Marcus would have said she shot off toward the fight, but it was more of a languished sprint. Seeing her break off, Marcus ran off after her, and the three they left behind were left to wonder what was going on. What the he dash? His words petered out as Marcus ran, but he called back, 6 is better than 5. Come on. He didn't have the time to explain the nuance. That Abigail was going to her brother no matter what, and he was forced to follow. He could only hope they were pragmatic enough to see that following was in their best interest. Thankfully, they were, and he felt them rush after them. Marcus followed Abigail through the bodies. The piles and piles of bodies. The ice and snow. The frosty fog. The frozen craters of water. And the bodies. So many bodies. The air chilled as they neared, and the water he had brought with him threatened to freeze. The force wasn't strong and trivial to fight off, but the fact it was there was surprising. The scene he came running up to made him stop dead. Abigail had run ahead without hesitation, but he had to stop. It was too much to take in. The trio caught up to him quickly and had the same reaction, pausing next to him and looking on with a mix of emotions. By the grace of... He heard one of them mutter, and it wasn't far off from how he felt. It was pure, unaltered carnage. The bodies had built and put the sea they had run through to shame. There were mountains of them. It felt like there were more lying dead or dying in this one area than his entire section combined. In the center of the carnage stood a man. The ice Marcus had seen him start the battle with was gone. The hammer he had once held missing. The glistening plate armor he once wore that made Marcus's own feel inadequate, hung from his battered form from fraying straps and torn leather. The metal was bent, punctured, torn, or sheared off completely. His upper half was bare. The once thick plate lost in the battle. His helmet was gone. The only evidence that he had worn the once resplendent suit of armor in the first place was one of the pauldrons hanging by his feet and a few plates on his legs. Everything else was lost. His body was riddled with black wounds, angry and festering from the vileness the orcs once had. The bleeding was constrained by thin flakes of ice, but not completely. The infection barred the ice from closing them. Deep purple blood leaked from him and dripped to the ground. His hands were frosted over and steaming. The thick layers of blood on both his arms extended to his elbows. Out in front of where the man stood was the most powerful orc Marcus had ever laid eyes on. It towered over Chris and was nearly double the man's height. Its muscles were flared and bulging. In one hand was a club wrought from what looked like the trunk of a tree ripped from the ground, and the other held a mighty axe nearly as tall as Marcus. Its bearded blade gleamed in the rare ray of sunlight. It was the most metal he had seen an orc carry. The war leader struck fear into his heart. Even from a distance and without being the focus of its attention, Marcus felt the crippling fangs of fear build in his head. The two mages on his side instinctively took a step back. Only he and Patrick faced the raw power and fury without faltering, but he sure wanted to. The orc stood a distance away and stopped, taking in those who stood against it. It eyed them all, and when the yellowing eyes landed on him, the urge to back away intensified tenfold. Marcus was struck silent. Roar! The ear-splitting roar was so much worse in person. It drilled into his brain and threatened to overwhelm him. Fear was an emotion that couldn't even convey the magnitude anymore. It was more primal than that. Primal fear, if such a thing was enough. His chest caught and his breath froze. His brain struggled to shake off the effect, and he could only stand there frozen. The sheer shock of what happened next jolted him awake, like someone had taken a defibrillator to his chest. Roar! It was nonsensical. It was bewildering, incredulous. Chris roared back. Words weren't enough to convey the raw emotion contained in the roar. One so much weaker than the orcs, but held something deeper. It had challenged, and Chris answered back. Somehow, even though he hadn't used words, Marcus understood. The deeper meaning was clear to all who heard it. Come at me. Chapter 282, Lunatic. Marcus POV. The fear fell away, and he fought to keep it that way. He was no coward, and he was better than that. He'd fought tides of insects and killed hundreds of orcs. He wasn't about to be paralyzed in fear just because of one extremely strong orc. An orc that could most likely kill him in 1 or 2 blows. An orc that looked like he could. No. He admonished himself and fought to keep the fear at bay. His feet were freed, and he hesitantly took his first step forward. Toward the danger. Toward the orc. That step shook off some of the paralyzing fear, and the next diminished it further. But while he had taken a paltry few steps, Chris had charged forward like it was just another enemy to face. Like this war leader was no different than the orcs that attacked at the start. The lack of fear, no, more than lack, devoid of the idea, startled Marcus. Every living thing had a fear response, and while Marcus was screaming at him to get as far away from the threat as possible, it was like Christopher's was broken. Shattered to pieces like the mountains of bodies at his feet. Christopher didn't even know they were there. He hadn't turned, and Marcus doubted. He was in a state to see anything further than his eyes took in. He saw the enemy, and he charged the enemy, not even realizing he had allies that had come to help him. Marcus could tell he wasn't thinking. His eyes were wild and unfocused. His aura was the same. He'd felt Chris unleash it a few times on the boats, and it was always steady as a rock. Or a glacier in his case. It was heavy and unmoving while also bringing a nipping chill along with it. If Marcus were weaker, that chill would have bit into his skin and sought to freeze him from within, but he could fight that off. Now, that image of a giant, unmoving glacier was replaced. In its place was a wild, fluctuating area of pure desolation. The warmth, the small piece there used to be, if it could be called that, was long gone. It used to be like the cold nip of a dark winter night. Now it was like what came after winter had reigned unchallenged for eons. It held no warmth, no qualities that could be considered life-giving, only destruction, and the cold and desolation were its instruments to achieve that. Marcus watched as the man charged toward the orc and cursed himself. He had a debt to repay, and he was too scared to move. His eyes flicked over to the 3 additions from the Great Lakes Alliance and was assured to see them in a worse state than he was in. Patrick's hands shook, and the axes he held wavered only slightly while the other 2 mages were frozen stiff. He looked over and expected to see Abigail in much the same state, but she was nowhere to be seen. Or, she wasn't in the position Marcus last saw her. She was hundreds of feet ahead of that. She had charged forward without stopping. How? She already had water rising around her, readying an attack to help her brother, while Marcus was still trying to break free from the fear. What is wrong with this family? Seeing his ally charge in, he marshaled his will and used it as a sledgehammer on the chains wrapping around him. He smashed it to pieces and could finally feel himself moving at a normal pace. Finally freed, he turned and slapped Patrick next to him. It probably wasn't the most diplomatic decision to hit a fellow faction leader, a suspected baron at that, but those thoughts didn't matter now. Not in the face of, "Wow, thank you." Patrick was startled from the hit but recovered himself well. He turned and administered the same medicine to the 2 mages behind him. The man took a little more to jar free, but it was only a moment of delay. At that moment, Marcus turned back to see the first blows rain down. Chris, devoid of his hammer, used his fists to meet the orc's club. A club the size of an ancient tree trunk, against a single man's fist. The tree won. Chris was driven back, and his body tore a line through the piles of bodies. Marcus feared injury, but that thought died as he saw the man launch himself back at the orc like he'd just been hit with a strong wind. Not with the weight of an entire tree swinging at insane speeds. His skin bore a new wound that tried to ice over the bleeding but couldn't fight off the blight to do so. Christopher's form flashed, and an icy blue radiated outward. Frost built up, but not in the way Marcus expected. He'd seen the man's frost armor before, and this wasn't it. It was the natural buildup of frost on something cold. The buildup one would see on an item in a deep freezer. The skill he was using wasn't frost armor, but for some reason, it felt even more powerful. Under the frost, his skin turned a shade of blue, instead of the pale white he'd seen the man as before. A defensive skill of some kind. Before the second strike could land, a whip made of water smashed down over the orc's head. It barely had enough force to break the skin, and any damage other than that was superficial at best. It worked to get the orc's attention, but only for a second. Chris came flying in at a level of strength Marcus would have said impossible if he hadn't been seeing it for himself. The orc, looking at Abigail, allowed his fist to land, and the meaty thud boomed over the battlefield. Where Chris had been launched back by the club, the orc slid back a few feet. A disparaging level of force between the two if Marcus had ever seen one, but it seemed like that fact didn't even register in Chris's mind. "Fucking lunatic," one of the mages muttered. That comment caused him to tear his eyes away from the nonsensical battle. "Patrick, right?" Marcus didn't stop for him to answer. "Do you have a spare axe?" Chris seems to have lost his weapon. "You know that madman?" The older man gasped but answered his question. "No. I usually carry a spare set, but I lost them in the fight before I got the technique down." "You mean he doesn't normally use his fists?" the woman mage muttered. From what she could see, the man was fighting comfortably without a weapon of any kind, yet Marcus was saying he was down a weapon. Marcus ignored her and plowed ahead. "The orc seems focused on Chris, so he'll tank. You and I will take the right and left flank." Patrick nodded. "Mages, stay back and do what you can." The mages nodded more hesitantly. "Good." Both Abigail and Chris were in the fight, and now it was time to prove his worth. His feet were freed, and he dug into the ground bodies under him to propel himself forward. They were frozen together and didn't slip under his heavy steps, which was a positive. Patrick charged in behind him while the mages followed. Marcus tried to get a feel for the orc and how he would go about fighting it. His glaive mastery was high, but he doubted it was enough to face the orc in single combat. His water scythes were powerful, but if a water whip from Abigail barely damaged it, his scythes wouldn't either. Flash flood would hurt his allies more than the orc, and he was quickly running out of skills to use. Still, he charged in anyway. Worst case, he would only use his glaive and do what he could. As he closed in, he noticed that the orc's skin was an odd color. It wasn't green like what he imagined it would be. It also wasn't the sickly muddled color the rest had been either. It was blue, similar in hue to what Christopher's now was. Not everywhere, as the black stripes and spots still adorned the war leader, but everywhere with visible skin was a faded blue color instead of green. The change was unimportant, and he instead went back to planning how not to die. Sweeping Strike and Water Blade were probably his best bet. He was too low on mana for his bigger skills, and while those were on the weaker side, they both worked to enhance his strikes. They gave him an extra bit of power with his glaive, and that was his best bet right now. He wasn't sure how many times he could activate them with his dwindling mana, but those were better than nothing. Christopher and the orc exchanged a few more blows, and it was clear that Chris was losing. He had to jump away from the axe completely, as he had no way to block, and the club sent him tumbling back. Any ice he managed to form got shattered in the path of the massive axe. Yet every time he got up and charged back in like nothing had happened. Abigail launched more spells and drills of water at the orc, but it only resulted in a small amount of black liquid seeping out. Marcus had tried to use water manipulation on the liquid earlier, and it hadn't worked. As he neared, he prayed silently. It wasn't even directed at anyone or anything, just for himself. He didn't scream or announce his presence, just set his feet and swung his glaive as powerfully as he could. Sweeping Strike activated, and the arc of his swing sped up and empowered it. Water Blade coated the edge of the blade and made the metal that much sharper. His strike landed effortlessly as the orc was focused completely on Chris, leaving him a free strike. He saw Patrick doing the same as him, launching both his axes at the orc's other leg. The blade of his glaive landed, and it stopped cold. The force of the sudden stop rattled up his arms, and his bones ached from the vibration. Fearing retaliation, Marcus jumped back and inspected the damage, which was pitiful. A wound barely a few inches long, and it didn't even penetrate the skin. How the hell were they supposed to kill the thing if they couldn't damage it? 2 more spells started raining down on the orc. A thick lightning bolt slammed into its chest while a weaker jet of water slammed home. A water and lightning mage. A good combination. He could tell the lightning did increase damage, as it was already soaked from the rain and Abigail's attacks. But even then, it wasn't enough to stun it for long. The patchwork hide it wore was blown away and burned, but it was only left with a black mark for the mage's trouble. The orc was surrounded, but it didn't alter from its incessant charge at Chris. Treated Marcus and Patrick as flies. Worse than flies, as you usually wave them away. They were just ignored. His glaive opened up a few more wounds, but nothing that could change the course of the fight. He couldn't see how Patrick was faring, but he doubted it was better. Supercharged lightning bolts continued to rain down, timed exactly after the two water mages doused the orc. Marcus could see its muscles seize, but only for the briefest of moments and only in a small area where the lightning hit. Sickening black blood continued to leak out of it, and the ground sizzled around them. Frozen from the cold and hardened, it began to dissolve. The water steamed and evaporated on its body, and his glaive deteriorated even faster. The war leader's blood was even more corrosive. Throughout it all, Chris landed punch after punch. Marcus feared his fists would break before the orc did, but he showed no pain or indication that his hands were breaking. His body frosted over every new wound it could, but Chris was bleeding more than the orc was. Marcus was about to go in for another attack when Patrick called out. Delaying his attack, Marcus looked over to see the man only holding one of his two axes. The other poked out from the orc's knee, slammed home and left in the wound. The shallow wound, but Patrick had opened it up wide enough to draw blood and plant his weapon inside. "Mary! Hit it!" Patrick yelled desperately. Marcus wasn't sure who Mary was, but he found out soon enough. The static energy bloomed and his arm hair, what was left of it, stood on end for what was about to happen. The build-up time was well worth it as the flash and crack of lightning blinded and deafened him for a second. It was larger than anything they'd thrown yet, and as his vision returned, he saw the orc kneeling. The axe used as the lightning rod was melted to slag, and he saw Patrick wince. But it was a worthy trade-off. Blood poured from the newly opened wound, and everyone capitalized on it. The water mages dug into everywhere that bled with blades, whips, and drills of water, seeking to drive the wounds wider and deeper. With a new prime target, their efforts started to bear fruit. Marcus returned to hammering his own leg, and Chris did what only he could do. With the orc kneeling, its height was halved and brought Chris within striking range. Like a shark smelling blood, Chris shot at the orc, and before it could gather itself, punched it in the face. The thud rocked the orc's head back, and Marcus could tell it was visibly stunned. But it lasted no longer than the lightning bolts from before. The only difference this time was Chris didn't need time to build up another spell. It was only a moment before his other fist landed, rocking its head back once more. Then another. How high is his strength? Another lightning blast slammed into its other leg, and Marcus noticed what they were trying to do. Two streams of water slammed into the leg right after, and Marcus swung away. They were trying to topple it on its back. The orc tried to right itself and stand, but it couldn't. Patrick slammed his remaining axe into the back of its injured knee every time it tried, and even if he hadn't, the meteor punches slamming into its face left it dazed enough. It was then that Marcus noticed something else. The orc was oddly sluggish. It was injured, its knee blown open, and it was currently getting beat to shit by a man turned feral, but for some reason it was more sluggish than it should have been. The mana in the air stirred, and Marcus leapt out of the way. If he could feel the mana from here, the mages were drawing on final attacks. He was proven right a moment later as a torrent of water slammed into the orc while lightning hit its other leg at the same time. The force of the water was enough to teeter it, and the lightning numbed its other leg just enough. Before the advantage wore off, Chris was there, slamming his bloody fists home one right after the other. It was too much for the orc. Too much for anything Marcus had seen, and it was sent careening over. The shockwave of the orc falling over upon its back staggered him, but it didn't for someone else. Chris leapt into the air and landed on the orc's chest. Eyes wild and fists bloody, he pummeled the orc with everything he had. The frost around his body left him. His skin turned back to a pale white, and blood began spurting from where he was landing his punches. Marcus couldn't tell if it was from Chris or the orc. All of it was mixing together into a sick amalgamation of purple and black. Thud after thud, punch after punch, fist after fist. Chris stood upon the orc's chest and rained down blow after blow, but the orc wasn't dying. He and Patrick weren't standing around and tried to cut open what they could, but they were ineffective. The mages were spent, the last of their mana used to topple the war leader. It was up to Chris to end it. Without a better idea, Marcus prayed Chris was there enough to hear his words. "Christopher, take this." Marcus noticed the training he'd done on the boats, the ability to empower words with one's aura, and hoped he'd done it right, to force the words deep enough into his brain for him to hear. After shouting, he threw his prized weapon, the glaive he'd carried with him for nearly a year. Whether Chris thought it was a projectile to deflect or if he heard the words Marcus shouted, his hand shot out and caught the weapon faster than his eyes could register. His left fist continued to rain down on the orc while his right held Marcus's weapon like it was a toothpick. As if the man was disinterested in something so light, ice formed and built up on the weapon. The shaft enlarged as ice built upon it, and the blade was soon encased. His once prized weapon became the core for a spike of ice. Chris paused his punches and grabbed the spike with both of his hands. Before the orc could raise a hand to defend, Chris raised it over his head and with a mighty shout, brought it down square on its face. Ah! Once wasn't enough, so he did it again. And again. The ice at the tip broke off, but he kept smashing the weapon down. It continued to break and shatter until the metal of the blade at its core slammed home and drove into the brain. The orc's body spasmed, but that didn't stop Chris. He raised the blade and did it again, causing another spasm. And another spasm. The orc stopped spasming after the fifth blow. Essence rushed into Marcus in higher quantities than ever before. It was so much that he felt the improvements from the levels. He didn't have to check his notifications to know he sat at level 100. The gasps from the others said they were also receiving the deluge of essence. Only one man didn't gasp or react. He continued to beat the orc's face into the ground. One smash after the other. Marcus watched as the ice around his weapon broke and shattered. Then the blade of his weapon shatter. Then the shaft of his weapon shatter. The wooden spray of splinters should have been enough to stop the man, but he continued his onslaught long after the orc was dead. All five of them stood and watched as the man dragged out the last of his energy, pounding the orc into paste without saying a word. They could only watch in disbelief as the thuds turned to squelches, and even those turned into something more grotesque. Either after finally realizing the orc was dead or noticing the rush of essence and notifications signaling the end of the fight, Chris stopped. Or he was finally out of energy. He stood up and straightened his back. His feet were firmly planted on top of the dead orc's chest, and there was even a blanket of other dead orcs under that. He stood, fists dripping with his own blood and the orc's, wounds numerous and bleeding all over his body, chest heaving with great effort, breath pluming out in frosty fog. Stood and screamed his victory. "Eh-ha-heh!" Screamed it into the liquidized face of the orc, into the face of the mountains of dead around him, into the face of everyone present, into the air and surrounding battlefield. He stood and proclaimed victory. Chapter 283 Pyrrhic. Marcus. Kant. POV. Christopher's aura, wild and flaring, disappeared abruptly. The once smothering blanket of otherworldly cold and fury left so quickly it made it seem like it hadn't even been there in the first place. It was such a stark difference. Marcus had to strain his own tired aura to make sure the man was still there and his eyes weren't deceiving him. The only other time he'd seen such an abrupt difference from flaring to gone was when someone died. Reining it in manually didn't result in such whiplash, even if Chris was in a state of mind to do it. From the pummeling he'd just witnessed, Marcus doubted the shift was manual. Chris stepped to get off the decapitated orc and faltered. His strength had left him. Marcus moved before he registered what he was doing and caught him before he fell. His body was freezing to the touch and his fingers burned, but he held the man upright through the pain. "Thank you." The words were nearly inaudible, but they were enough. While that was all good, and Marcus was glad to be of help, there was one thing on his mind after watching the orc die. What now? There were 3 more out there somewhere. He couldn't feel them anymore, and by the notifications rolling in and the essence transferring, the fight was over. But was it? When in a prolonged fight, the system usually delayed any distraction until the fight was over, but it had done so now. Did that mean that all the other war leaders were already dead? For some reason, Marcus doubted that. He wasn't so arrogant to believe that others didn't have the ability to kill them, but not nearly as quickly. The fight had lasted only a couple of minutes and Chris did most of the work. Killing it any faster would be a challenge he didn't believe every other faction could accomplish. 1. He could believe. 2. Defeating the orc more quickly was pushing it, but all three. The odds of all three war leaders getting killed faster than they had killed their own was astronomical, and Marcus didn't believe that was the case for a second. Lightning still boomed. Rain still pelted the ground. The wind still howled. Something was still going on. But it was going on elsewhere. There wasn't an orc in sight where they stood. Not a living one, at least. Marcus had enough strength that carrying the other man wasn't difficult. But it did force him to circulate the dregs of mana he had left. He'd spent all he had in the battle and could only use what little he'd already regenerated to defend against the cold. Christopher's body was like holding on to dry ice without gloves. It wasn't long until Abigail came running up, breathing heavily. Marcus recognized a healing skill flare, but it was paltry at best. The mana used was tiny and he could see the skill falter before activating. Abigail was worse than he was to have such a weak skill falter. The energy did essentially nothing to Chris's body. The blight still waged war inside his wounds and his skin blackened and festered around the bleeding. It would take a dedicated healer with a lot more mana than anyone here had to cleanse the wounds. How many this time? Christopher's voice was weak. Without the perception boost from stats, it would be impossible to hear. Marcus's face tightened. He'd had the same thought and he still wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. He'd seen many get cut down and knew that plenty more perished outside his gaze. Friends he'd fought with for years met their end and his heart ached. Part of him wanted to rush back and count right this moment, but another part knew his heart wouldn't be able to take it. Abigail's face remained emotionless. 2 that I know of. 2? There were a lot more than oh no. They were out here speaking of family members. Not faction members. 2 of their family were dead and they were acting like it was nothing. How many this time? How speak so casually about the death of family? Mom and Gabriel? Hope was the last emotion Marcus would say Chris had right now, and that somehow made it worse. Alive. Abigail also didn't hold the right notes. It was like all emotion, good or bad, was stripped from them. John and Austin? Alive. Who? Alice and Allison. 2 names were spoken, and the only thing Chris did was close his eyes. Marcus had even met Alice when she'd attempted to forge a core, and even he showed more emotion at hearing that she had died. Marcus was struck silent at the interaction, but something else caught his eye. The 3 helpers were all huddled together off to the side, talking softly about something. Something Marcus was sure he wouldn't like. Abigail, can you take him? He asked. The woman nodded and scooped up his other side while Marcus extradited himself. In any other situation, seeing such a small woman holding up his large body would be humorous, but not now. Not after. The 2 continued their limp back toward the walls while Marcus went to go have words with their friends. If you're thinking about doing what I think you're doing, I'd advise against it. Marcus wasn't in the mood to sugarcoat his words. He was too tired for that. He was so tired he didn't notice he was weaponless and manaless approaching 3 potentially hostiles. The 3 turned toward him, but Marcus didn't see the calculating eyes he expected. The ones contemplating something better left alone. Was I wrong? We heard that his pylon is in northern Canada? Patrick said. And yours is in Minneapolis? The question threw him as he expected an entirely different interaction. One a lot more heated. Yes, my pylon sits where Minneapolis and St. Paul once did. His, he gestured at the 2 departing backs, is in the far north. His faction was well known enough because of talk from the reservation and the Heartlands Alliance that most people knew, or could find out where it was. There was no point in hiding it. Frostheim, though, was harder to find, but it being in the far north was well known. Do you think he would be open to talks? The man hinted, and Marcus finally understood what was going on. It was the other side of the coin. Good. Lightning streamed around one man with eyes alight with electric fury. From his hands flew bolts so thick and destructive that those watching equated it to the wrath of God himself. The orc hit by such fury could do nothing but stand there and take the punishment. Every move it made to quell the storm was met by ravaging members of its own kind. Hundreds of orcs launched themselves at what was once their leader and pinned it in place. They were ants to an elephant, but they kept the war leader occupied long enough. They moved with mechanical, jerky movements, but there were too many of them for that to matter. When one was cut down, another jumped in to take its place with an unnatural lack of self-preservation. The sea of the deathly orcs was endless, and the tactics of the test were turned against itself. In the back was the orchestrator of such a tide as death mana flowed around him in waves. The occasional spell landed on the war leader that deadened the already blight-touched skin. Lightning and death were used interchangeably, and while most of the horde of dead gave their second lives, the war leader perished. Rain evaporated and turned to steam well before hitting the ground. A thick fog built around the fight, but that didn't hinder the group fighting. One stood encased in dense stone, wielding a shield and mace that took any hit the war leader could conjure. Pillars, shields, domes of stone, both intact and smashed open, riddled the field from her efforts. A man with lava coating his hands dished out powerful, staggering punches while his comrade held the orc at bay. Last of the powerful trio was a woman literally ablaze. Fire lashed out from her hands and burnt everything near to cinders. A dozen archers and mages, emboldened by their leader's ability to keep the orc occupied, took the time to empower arrows and spells, wishing to be of assistance. It was long, arduous, and rife with danger, but the stone held firm. Cracked and weakened it was, but stout enough that the attacks against it couldn't crush it completely. The land was burned black, with still flowing lava hissing and popping as it flowed into water or blood. What had dried left a scar of jagged black rock in place of the once beautiful forest. The war leader was filled with too many arrows to count, burned in more places than unburned, and hit with so many spells that its only option was to perish, all the while unable to break through the woman of stone hemming it in place. It died slowly. Hundreds surrounded the war leader while they watched their leader do what he could, his halberd taking on power unlike they'd ever seen. Anyone wishing to intrude on the fight was blown back just by the shockwaves generated. The thousands at his back were all pushing their hopes for their leader's victory, but it was more than just their hopes. They gave something much more tangible. Drawing on the thousands of strings connected to him, their leader, the mighty admiral, held off the powerful orc. Those surrounding the battle took this time to land any and all attacks they could. But none were as powerful as one woman. Dark skin twinkling in the dark, stormy sky, drew on the very stars themselves to launch spells. Spells of starlight landed upon the black-spotted skin of the orc, and it roared in fury and pain. With a halberd filled with the power of thousands, spells wrought from the stars themselves, and thousands adding what little they could, the war leader was chipped down one attack at a time until it could stand no longer. The cheers echoed through the land as the last war leader perished. The last orc sent to test the defenders fell, and the chimes informing the inhabitants of their victory sent waves of palpable victory through the masses. They hooted and hollered, cheered into the stormy sky until voices could be heard from miles away. The moment of exuberant joy at their victory lasted but a moment, until the sea of the dead centered their minds. Then, instead of exuberance, it was sorrow that filled the defenders. Sorrow for their family, sorrow for their friends, sorrow at the scale of death that most had never seen before. Of what once was a resplendent sea of defenders numbering nearly 300,000 strong, none still shone so brightly and eager like they had just hours before. That glow was long since lost and the eagerness destroyed. Of the once great armies of countless factions, combining into a force not seen since the change, half were dead. Some factions destroyed utterly and completely. Leaders and followers alike lay together near broken walls and torn apart fortifications, staring up at a sky they would see for the last time. Half. A number so large the defenders had trouble wrapping their minds around the death toll. A number large enough for some to question themselves. Question if it was worth it. Over 3/4 wounded, some graver than others. A Pyrrhic victory if there ever was one. A victory won at one obelisk. One obelisk of 13. Chapter 284 Epilogue. The Emporium awaits. Volwyn Zilris POV. Planet Dervingard, Sector 116 to 134. Volwyn was nervous to the point of nearly sweating, and that spoke to how anxious he was. His race never sweat. This was to be his first big assignment, and he couldn't mess it up. It was finally his chance to make it big, and now that the opportunity had arisen, he would make the most of it. He stood in the large hall with dozens of his comrades as they all watched the screen in front of them intently. The rotating planet had 13 large makers on it, with a few already turned green. Some were still gray, and only one was red. He knew somewhere else in the Emporium's complex, a similar great hall was filled with people standing at the ready should the planet fail, which, given the current situation, was rather unlikely. Every metric or survey from the few divinations or scrying attempts Volwyn knew of said the planet had great odds at passing. The chances of failing were already low from the it only being an E-rank assessment, but since there was still an outside chance they could fail, another team needed to be gathered just in case. Volwyn hoped they didn't fail. He, along with the dozens of others gathered in the same hall, sat at the peak of E-rank. All of them capped at level 100. While some in the universe were stuck at E-rank because they lacked the requirements, everyone in the hall was E-rank by choice, including Volwyn. He had long ago upgraded his law to Tier 2, but he'd stayed in E-rank anyways, partially for the opportunity now in front of him. It was a once-in-a-lifetime event that most in the Emporium had never experienced before, yet he stood at the ready to grasp it. While he, his team, and everyone else in the hall were only E-rank, the other group's lowest members were already well into D-rank. The grunts, as they were called. Then there were the C-rank managers, followed by the sole B-rank the Emporium had available. Volwyn hadn't even seen a B-rank before, yet he knew one was somewhere on the premises. Which team that would be deployed depended on whether the planet passed or failed. If they passed, the Great System's protections would prohibit anyone above E-grade from setting foot on the planet, hence why his entire group were all below that threshold. The Frost Rose Emporium wasn't a large trading company. Most would consider it on the rather small side compared to the Golden Road Company and the Broken Spear Trading Group. Those two were the largest mercantile empires in the nearby sectors, and they had dealings in dozens of different sectors with hundreds of planets. Both were made up of the most ahem entrepreneurial races. The gnomes and the goblins were always seeking out avenues of wealth. The greedy green bastards. Competition was fierce, and the bidding for a planet's first trading rights comprised more gold than Volwyn had ever imagined, let alone seen in the flesh. Every trading hall, merchant group, or auction house in the sector wanted a piece of what was to come. There were even a few from neighboring sectors that butt in for a slice. It wasn't every day that an integration happened. The last integration was millennia ago, and not even Volwyn's great-great-grandfather was alive then, and frost elves were known for their longevity. It was his lucky fate that the newly integrated planets were located in his sector. The placement used to be random, or so history said. Volwyn very well wasn't alive to confirm it. The Great System would move the newly integrated planets to random sectors of the universe and be done with it. That had never ended well for the newly integrated. They were either too far away to truly integrate, or they ended up bordering, or worse, inside of an already established power. The odds they were placed far enough away to not be conquered, yet close enough that trade was viable, was low. Lower than low. Those placed in or near other kingdoms and empires never lasted long. They were lucky if the power was benevolent enough to send them somewhere else after conquering the planet, but most weren't that lucky. Now it was more clustered. The new planets were placed together, far enough away from established powers to not doom them, but near enough to others that they weren't left isolated. It also introduced first rights. Any trading group could bid for the opportunity to select a planet and, with the system's aid, teleport in and set up shop. Without that aid, the low-tier goods and services the new citizens would trade for were never worth the logistical expenses to get it there. Transporting E-rank goods more than a few planets away was never profitable, yet those goods would have the biggest demand. It wasn't until a planet started having demands for D-rank or C-rank goods that it became profitable without the Great System's help. That change made new integrations some of the busiest times for merchants. Integrations used to only be the entertainment of gods. Those who had the power or resources to scry past the Great System's protections or the desire to poke their head into what was new. No one else could waste the resources on something so frivolous, let alone have the power to do so. There were maybe a few legendary S-ranks who could do it, but their time was better spent elsewhere, not wasting it watching children. "Are you ready, Volwyn?" his secretary asked. Jekkas had been Volwyn's aide for years, and he couldn't ask for one better. The ice gnome had a similar blue hue to his skin as his own, but rather than the icy white hair frost elves were known for, his was a deep black. The Frost Rose Emporium specialized in anything cold-aligned, and that included their staff. Only the rare few companies that spanned multiple planets were made up solely of one race, and the Emporium was not one of them. In the hall, there were half a dozen different races represented, and if one were to count all the variations, there would be dozens. Volwyn wasn't the only frost elf in the group, just as Jekkas wasn't the only ice gnome present. There were a dozen teams of 8 ready to set out once the assessment was over. Volwyn led his team as the only frost elf, with Jekkas, an ice gnome, Rangrick, a glacier dwarf, and a quintet of Ursonian humans. All were from Arctic planets and had similar characteristics that came from such an environment. Either pale or blue-tinted skin, white or black hair with little variation, and a natural chill to them with body temperatures rarely above 0. The Emporium usually only dealt with pure Arctic planets covered either solely or majorly in ice. It was where they traded best and their margins against other trading houses was widest. The new integration only had a few solely Arctic planets, and the Emporium was not large enough to win the bid for them. Some because they weren't worth it, some because they wouldn't be able to afford it, and others because their bid wasn't high enough. They weren't the only to specialize in the cold. Instead, they had won a partial bid for a more diverse planet. It had large poles in the north and south that were desirable, but those were far from the majority. The seasons were a nice touch. Not every planet had those, and Volwyn had never been on a world that changed like that. Winter seemed like a wonderful time as the Arctic nearly doubled in size during those months. Winning a partial bid meant they weren't the sole company to have rights, but that was what was agreed upon. After losing out on the other planets, the Emporium and other smaller companies got together to split one planet rather than lose out on all of them. Plus, the planet was perfect for future expansion. The reports had it rated at B grade, which was nearly unheard of for newly integrated planets. B-grade planets were prized by well-established powers, let alone new ones. The bidding went so high Volwyn nearly fainted. Both the Broken Spear Group and the Golden Road Company vied for the planet and were only barely outbid by the Emporium's alliance. The capital of a dozen companies was just enough to win the bid out from under the two Goliaths. If the two companies had forwent the rest of the planets like the Emporium had, there was zero chance of the small companies winning at all. Other than being rated as B-grade, there were millions of inhabitants already populating it. Millions in need of goods and resources. Over 2,000 pylons ready for trade. The 13 markers lit up in gray, red, or green weren't the only ones populating the projection. There were thousands of smaller ones, denoting all the various pylons placed throughout the land. Some larger than others with areas spanning more land. The 8 continents were filled with life. Well, 6 of them were, but that would soon change as they expanded to fill in the gaps. It was a pity that the most preferable continent was uninhabited. The reports they had on it made Volwyn wish it had been. Covered in a thick sheet of ice thousands of meters thick, temperatures so low even he would have to ward against it. Winds and snow year-round. Just imagining it made his blood yearn for it, yet it wasn't meant to be. Only a scant 3 pylons were placed on the entire continent with a population barely in the hundreds, 2 of which would soon fall. Sadly, it wasn't worth the effort. Instead, the Emporium would focus on the far north. There were already a large number of pylons lining the edge of the lands of Everwinter, while over a dozen of those were large enough to host planetary nobles. The dozen teams were all given a noble city to focus on, and Volwyn's was on the 3rd largest continent. While they would set up in the baronies, they would seek to reach every city near the lands of Everwinter. Part of the reason the other companies agreed to split the bid was because of their nature. The Frost Rose Emporium seldomly had issue with the Timeless Sands group. They dealt in vastly different goods. The Verdant Lotus House equally traded in a different corner of the market. The goods where they did overlap, like general necessities, foodstuffs, skill shards, and the like, had small enough margins that fighting over it wasn't worth the coin. The jurisdiction of each company had already been decided and agreed upon. All that was left was for the planet to pass the assessment and they would be sent in. It was unfortunate that they'd have to go through the obelisks rather than teleport directly to the cities they were responsible for, but there was little Volwyn could do about that. Jekaz watched another marker turn green and smiled. "Looks like we get our wish." Volwyn grinned as well. While he said it was unlikely for the planet to fail, unlikely did not mean impossible. "All right, everybody, listen up." Gorgas brought the large hall to attention. The manager was in C rank and wouldn't be able to go, but he was in charge of those who did. "The planet has passed its assessment, which means you will be our only contact point for the foreseeable future. The guards each of you have are well trained and will keep you safe. Your safety is paramount." Volwyn glanced at the quintet of Ursonians who were his guards. "If a city leader gets aggressive or is otherwise unagreeable, you are free to seek out opportunities elsewhere." The Emporium couldn't afford the teams to get any larger. They were already paying for nearly 100 teleportation slots. Any more guards and they'd have to cut down on the number of teams. Volwyn's team was split in two in regard to responsibility. He was in charge of all mercantile affairs. Jekaz was his second and secretary. Rangrick was their appraiser and rune expert, with the rest being guards. "Everyone knows your assigned tasks." Gorgas continued. "Everyone has what they need to evolve once you're planetside. Reports state that only a handful of the natives have already reached D rank, but that does not make you safe. You all know not to underestimate first-generation integrated. First-generation integrated normally had a higher level of power than the average person. Being put through a tutorial and having such an event transpire that rewrites their history, judging their strength by level was far from enough. Volwyn, even with the threat the natives posed, couldn't help but grin. He'd kept himself at the peak of E rank just for this occasion, and he'd finally be able to level again. Everyone here would. He couldn't wait to evolve. He already made sure the class and profession he wanted were available so that there would be no mishaps. Jekaz had done the same, and he doubted Rangrick hadn't. The humans were a touch different as their evolution was more involved. Volwyn's gaze turned toward the small bundles tied to their hips subconsciously. The racial trait humans had was fascinating to him, and this would be his first time witnessing such an event. He estimated he'd see so many he'd eventually get sick of them, but he was looking forward to the first. The planet they were going to was filled with humans, after all. "We, the Emporium, await good results from each of you." Gorgas finished and stepped off the stage. Even with his speech concluded, everyone still waited anxiously in the large hall. The planet wouldn't open until every marker was colored, and there were still a few gray ones yet to turn. As another changed to green, that left only one more and then they would be off. "What do you think the name is?" Jekaz asked to break up the silence. Volwyn didn't take his eyes off the last uncolored marker. "I don't know and I don't care." Jekaz gave him a side eye. "You don't care what the planet you're going to is named? I find that hard to believe." In all the reports they had, in addition to the projection in front of them, the planet was designated an I-151-104. It wouldn't be changed until the natives themselves elected to change it, or it was conquered and renamed. While Jekaz was right, and Volwyn did care what its designation ended up being, now wasn't the time to ponder on it. They were moments away from teleporting. "I wager it's some variation of Earth. It seems like all natives name it after the ground for some reason. Don't you find that odd?" Jekaz remarked. Volwyn only grunted. Earth, or some variation of Earth, be it Stonehome, Rockhome, or the like, was by far the most common designation natives called their planet. "What would this make it, Earth 328? Jekaz mused. There weren't 328 different planets all called Earth. That would be needlessly confusing, but it was humorous that so many decided on the same name. The last marker turned green and Jekaz stopped talking. "Here we go." Chapter 285 sat and watched. Chris POV. It felt like I was having an out-of-body experience. My mind would send the signal for my legs to move, but it was delayed, lagging behind for some reason. My body was racked with so much aching pain that I worked hard to tune all of it out, which didn't help matters. The only positive was that I didn't pass out. I sure wanted to, and I knew sleep was calling my name soon, but I forced myself to stay awake, conscious as we walked through the scenes of destruction. The scenes of my destruction. It didn't fill me with joy to see what I had done. It didn't invoke pride to see the slaughter I had handed out. Sure, the fight was brutal and I took satisfaction in knowing I had won. Knowing I stood above those that lay dead. But it was hollow. Seeing all the human bodies mixed in with the orc bodies made it so. Still, even the burning grief was dull, just like everything else. The feeling was like a river already worn through me, and now it was just new water running through old grooves. The banks had already been viciously carved. It was just time to fill it with the most recent waters. My morose thoughts were hard to banish while gazing upon the battlefield. Abigail also said nothing. We were both reeling in our own way. While I wasn't that close to my cousin Alice, she was still family. Family that wasn't with us anymore. Sam was going to be devastated. She'd already lost a husband and son. Now she lost a daughter as well. Allison wasn't family by blood, as she had married Mitchell to enter the Zelensky family, but her loss was still felt. I wouldn't be surprised if Mitchell was out there cradling her lifeless body with tears streaming down his face. The image was unpleasant but impossible to push away. Other than the grief of loss, I felt guilty. Guilty that my first thought after hearing who had fallen wasn't sorrow, but relief. My worst fear was my mother or Gabriel dying. I'd seen Abigail, so I knew one of the names wasn't hers. Then I'd thought of John and Austin. When I heard it was Alice and Allison, I felt relieved, and a part of me hated that. I felt ashamed. Getting closer to the wall only made the sight more ugly. The roaring fire that I'd felt when the battle started was thoroughly smothered, seeing its aftermath. Blood saturated the land and ran in streams so thick it made me want to gag. Body parts were strewn about every which way, taken off by sword, spell, or explosion. Bodies in states better left unmentioned and would burn into my memory. I looked at my notifications to distract myself. I didn't want to see the bodies. The eyes staring up at me. You have slain. 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 Congratulations. You have leveled up. 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 Skills available. Name, Christopher Zelensky. Race, E, human asterisk. Class, E, hammer of the Jotner. Legendary. Level 100. Profession, E, runesmith. Rare, level 88. Affinity, Arctic. Faction, Frostheim, leader. Title Baron. Strength, 1822. Agility, 879. Perception, 534. Fortitude, 1348. Endurance, 1061. Vitality, 669. Intelligence, 447. Wisdom, 767. Acumen, 430. Free points, 50. Level 100. I was ready to evolve. Of course, I was going to wait until my profession was ready along with getting materials somehow. But I was ready. I didn't know how it felt. The excitement, the achievement was still there. I was proud of reaching it, but I couldn't bring myself to feel it. Numb, if that was even the right word for it. A new skill, my final skill for this class, didn't even bring joy like it should have. My eyes drooped and I felt sleep call me once again, but I pushed it away. Not yet. Did you hit 100? I asked at nearly a whisper. It hurt to speak, and it took everything in me to get my voice at even that volume. Abigail was silent for a moment. Yes, she was even closer than I was. Her profession had hit 100 a while ago. The upgrade to a small city along with the monthly waves earned her a lot of experience for her profession. Every successful defense of the city she administered was an influx of essence straight into her profession. The rapid growth and production also helped. How well we did in trade, how much coin we pulled in from taxes, and the productivity of those she ruled over. All of it worked to rocket her profession to the level cap quicker than anyone else. Maybe a few had beaten her, but they didn't speak of it. I suspected Austin did, but he didn't say. The rare time he liked to keep it mysterious. Now we just needed to find her a naiad part. Somehow, while the notifications had rolled in from the fight, the assessment was still not completed. Kill notifications, level up notifications, and skill selections were all there, but there was nothing from the assessment. Maybe another obelisk is still fighting? The storm still rumbled overhead, but the ear-piercing cracks from supercharged lightning were dormant. The winds were losing their edge and the rain fell normally now, not the deluge of thick sheets it once was. None of the sounds of battle were still heard. Trebuchets and catapults were silent. Arrows didn't whistle through the air. Dying roars or clashes of weapons were absent. Our fight was over. The wall looked demolished. Any resonance my anchor once felt with the energy I had saturated it with was long gone. Used up to keep it standing for as long as possible. Jonathan's too. It didn't feel like anything anymore. Just normal, mundane stone. The laws and mana it once held from mason skills or earth mages was also gone. It once stood over a dozen feet tall and gleamed in my mana senses. It once shouted its defense to all those who could hear. It was in pieces now. Blocks torn down, holes smashed through it, and what was once great, sundered. The bodies were deeper here. Row upon row lay on top of one another. Orc atop human atop orc. All of the death melded together. It became hard to distinguish one body from the next. Some even had patches of wolves and bears upon them. Members of orders. Guards sworn to me. Now they were dead. Nothing more was said. With Abigail's help, I limped over the rubble of the wall and toward where our camp stood. We had moved it in preparation and it was still intact. A few tents and structures collapsed from the foul weather or an attack gone awry, but it was still functional. Passing by the first aid camps was a bloody sight. It felt like there were more dismembered limbs piled there than the entire battlefield. I knew that wasn't true, and was just the fact I saw them in piles thrown away, but that didn't make it any less gruesome. Moans of pain, screams of anguish. I let the healers work undisturbed. I could do nothing and frankly I didn't want to be there. While my body was a mess, I wasn't in any threat of dying just yet. Without having to expend my energy to fight, all my effort turned to keeping myself kicking. Frozen patchwork, without any additional injuries or blight to fight off, finally frosted over my wounds and staunched the bleeding. The disease was still there, I could feel it working its way into my body, but it could be healed later. Others were in greater need. Walking through our camp was nearly as morose as the quiet battlefield. People sat on logs with blank expressions. Haunted expressions. Silence reigned as uttering a word somehow felt wrong. Everyone mended one injury or another. Some were worse off with either a leg or arm missing, while others only had small cuts or scrapes. All energy was drained, used up for survival. Breaking through to where my family camped was little better. Austin sat missing an arm with black wounds festering on his bare chest. His armor lost similar to my own. Gabriel and my mother were both next to him but still had all their appendages. Jonathan. I wasn't sure where Jonathan was, but Abigail said he was alive. Hal's bow was broken at his feet and bandages were wrapped generously around his head and chest. Rachel, the once roaring fire, sputtered in my senses. Her once fountain of mana gone. Her wounds were light considering the rest. Most of the mages had light wounds. Alice and Allison's bodies were set to the side. Pale. Lifeless. Eyes closed never to open again. Mitchell cried over his wife while his sister lay not 5 feet away in the same state. Everyone else sat in silence. Some shed silent tears of their own and others just watched on listlessly. Abigail set me down on a seat before leaving back the way she had come, but I didn't focus on what she was doing. My eyes were focused on the bodies. How is someone supposed to process this? Where do I even start? The sun poked through the clouds intermittently, and from its brief arrival, I could tell that time was passing, but I couldn't bring myself to notice. We'd fought for who knows how long, and I'd sat there afterward for an amount of time I couldn't remember. I just sat and did nothing. Sat and watched. Sat and pondered. Sat and grieved. Abigail had returned at one point carrying an unconscious Jonathan, with her not unsimilar to how she had carried me. The man still had pieces of mud caked on him with clumps of harder earth in some places. It looked like the man had been buried and recently dug up. His wounds were similar to Austin's and my own, except he had both arms intact. His twin shields were broken somewhere on the battlefield like my own weapon had been. Something felt odd with him though, different than before. It didn't feel like a wound and it wasn't cause for alarm, but he felt diminished. I wasn't sure if anyone else felt it as no one mentioned it. He had held his ground admirably. That much was clear from the state of him. I'd seen a fair amount of crushed orc bodies to know who was responsible. I wanted to ask where she found him but couldn't bring myself to do it. Felt wrong to speak. A number of times, I caught sight of Sophia out of the corner of my eye but never had the energy to call her over. I noticed her rushing throughout the camp doing something, but I didn't care enough to know right now. It was probably taking stock, compiling casualty reports, or making lists of the state of everything, but I just didn't care. Sure, I would have to at some point. I couldn't wallow forever, but just not now. Grace, Abigail's assistant, was with her and both were doing several things by how busy they looked. Someone had sent for the non-combatants at some point. It felt like the fight had just ended, yet a stream of people came rushing in. They had been sent across the river to stay behind the walls of the city, but now that the fight was over, they came streaming back. They did what little they could. A few more healers tended the wounded. A few builders made camp for those that had been destroyed. Merchants, well, I wasn't quite sure what they did. All stores of potions or herbs had already been sold. Even the civilians from the city came out to help. Some were still F-rank, yet they stood and chipped in with whatever they could do. My heart, once roaring and the cause of rivers of mana rushing through me, sputtered and choked. I had ridden it hard, pushed it as far as it could go. The mana pumping through me was diminished. My regeneration scuttled, but it was enough. Enough for what I needed to do. My muscles protested, but they'd been given time to rest. A few hours if I had to guess. The soreness and aching were very real, and I was dreading the next day as it would only be worse. But today, right now, I pushed through. Walking was hard. Any healer would probably say I should be resting, but those thoughts were meaningless. The first thing I did after rising was walk over to Alice. She'd just turned 21, an age that used to be a cause for celebration, where her only worry would have been getting eyed at a bar or liquor store. Instead, at the age of 19, she'd been dragged off to hell where she watched those she loved fall around her. Her father, her brother, her cousins, her aunts and uncles, and even her boyfriend. She'd survived that hell only to see it happen again. She'd fought beasts, dungeons, even demons, but had fallen to orcs. Her once blonde hair was matted down with blood and mud, caked on like she'd been stepped on and pushed into it. Abigail, sensing what I was about to do, obliged me. Her mana was in the same state as my own, as everyone's was, but she did it anyway. A gentle rush of water washed away the blood and grime. The mud broke off and she was restored to a fitting condition. An arrow hole still pierced her chest. The hole to where her heart once vibrantly beat still marred her, but at least she wasn't covered in mud. After Abigail's waters receded, I pulled. It was painful and I felt the mana channels turn blood vessels ache, but I pulled anyway. Ice froze around her until she was encased. Mitchell looked up pleadingly, not willing to let his wife go, so I gave him time. I come back for Allison. There were others that I had to go get. Chapter 286. Not just survivor's guilt. Chris POV. My mind was elsewhere as I worked. It was nearly autonomous to pick up the fallen and carry them back. My hands once again dripped with blood, but this time it wasn't from fighting. Those with stomachs brave enough joined in my efforts, pulling corpses from under orcs or out of mud. I didn't encase them yet. They needed to be washed first. It was disrespectful to those who had paid the ultimate sacrifice to sully them like that, enshrining them when they were at their worst. Instead, they were laid out respectfully, or as respectfully as we could. Some were too much. Smashed beyond a person should. It was tireless work that I spent even more time completing. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, it felt like the entire day had been lost in my head. Hours spent fighting flew by, followed by hours still sitting and coping. If what I did could really be called coping. Then, hours were spent gathering the dead. So many hours. The first aid tents stayed busy long after the last orc fell. Healers and helpers alike buzzed around with an urgency nothing I'd seen could ever match. Nothing surpassed the efforts they put in to save as many as they could as they acted like angry bees defending a nest. Admirable work. Righteous work. Bloody work. They were calling for blood donors. Blood could be encouraged to replenish faster using healing skills and mana, but it still took something from the body to make. It wasn't conjured from mana alone. Those with serious wounds couldn't afford any wastage in terms of healing. Plus, mana was a precious commodity that many healers had already long run out of. Any mana potion that could be spared was sent their way, but even that wasn't enough. Only so many potions could be imbibed in such a short time. To save as much as possible in both mana and healing, donated blood was used instead. I wasn't sure how donation worked after the change, but there was someone cleansing it of foreign influence before they shoved it into a body. Or at least I hoped so. I assumed they knew what they were doing. I wasn't even sure I had the same blood type. My blood carried my mana and was tainted with my spirit. So I couldn't donate, but many could and sat at the ready to give it. There weren't that many people with mana hearts, let alone spirit anchors, and mine were intrinsic to my blood and not so easily separated. There was also my heart to consider. It wasn't exactly au naturel. I suspected I would be able to donate eventually, but none of the healers knew how to separate my blood from the rest of what it was mixed with. As my trips to and from the battlefield grew, so too did my time to think, even though I wished I hadn't. Think about everything. What had happened, what hadn't happened. What I did right. What I could have done better. I poured my all into defending as many as I could, and I wasn't punishing myself for not doing enough. My body nearly tore apart at the seams. There wasn't much more I could have done. It was in planning and leadership that I felt at fault. It wasn't the first time either. Unhelpful ideas of what I could have insisted upon at meetings surfaced. If I could have made everyone listen, maybe it would have turned out better? If coordination between the factions had been better, would more still be alive? I knew the thoughts were useless. It wouldn't have done anything. I could have tried, sure, but it wouldn't have ended any differently. Hell, it could have ended worse than it had. But the ideas surfaced anyway. It also gave me time to review other notifications. Those that had happened during the fight that I had dismissed to look at later. Skill upgrades. 6 of them to be exact. Nearly more than I'd ever upgraded, all in one fight. I hadn't looked at them earlier because it made me feel bad. Like a worse version of survivor's guilt, as not only did I survive while others didn't, I received something from it. Most of the skills were obvious. One of the first to upgrade happened early on in the fight when I was still adjusting to fighting against those wielding weapons. You have upgraded a skill. Heavy Armor Proficiency. Journeyman. Heavy Armor Proficiency. Adept. Adept rank was something even my heavy weapon proficiency hadn't reached yet. I felt it when it happened too. My urge to position correctly to have axes and clubs deflect instead of land square pushed it over the edge. My movement in my armor had become smoother and less restricted after the upgrade. Usually, such an upgrade would constitute making an entirely new suit of armor, but that was already something I needed to do. It had slowly gotten destroyed through the fight. Other than armor proficiency, another that upgraded early was a skill I'd had for nearly the same amount of time as armor proficiency. You have upgraded a skill. Ice Manipulation. Uncommon. Ice Manipulation. Rare. Surprisingly, this upgrade happened differently than how I'd done it before. Upgrading it to uncommon took skillful and precise manipulation of ice itself. This upgrade came from my efforts to keep my hammer from getting destroyed. Freezing the blight and ripping it from my weapon forced me to bend the skill further and wider than it once was. I had been close already, but the new application had pushed it over the edge. You have upgraded a skill. Frost Armor, Rare, Dash, Glacial Heavy Plate, Epic. Frost Armor was the next to upgrade. Trying to keep it active through the corrosive properties of the blood was mind-breaking work. I'd poured my law and spirit into the layer of ice trying to keep it from dissolving, and I'd pushed the skill up a rank. While Adept was at the same rank as Epic, this felt different. This was the first time I'd personally upgraded a skill to Epic. Based on the text, it took my efforts to make it more durable to heart. Glacial Heavy Plate, Epic. Creates heavy, thick plates of ice armor wrought from glaciers themselves. Durability is determined by fortitude and gains an increased benefit from all heavy armor-related skills. It wasn't the last to reach Epic, as the other three were also skills going from Rare to Epic as well. The next was the skill I'd had for the longest. It was also one I'd personally upgraded all the way from Common without any shortcuts. You have upgraded a skill. Mighty Blow, Rare, Dash, Meteor Strike, Epic. Meteor Strike, Epic. Strike with the weight of a meteor behind your blows. Can use a combination of mana, stamina, or spirit to enhance strikes past their natural limit in strength and heaviness. Its text left a lot to be desired, but every upgrade of that skill only had a line or two of text. Hell, Power Strike only had one. Still, the upgrade expanded what could be used as fuel for the skill and how hard it hit. The upgrade had come when I'd sort of lost myself. There wasn't a better way to put it. By that point in the fight, I'd lost my armor and my hammer, resorting to punching anything that came close. It was using Mighty Blow on my bare fists and punching with my full fury that pushed it over the edge. Or at least I thought so. I wasn't exactly in the right state of mind. The last two happened at the same time near the end of the fight, and they had similar effects. I'd used them in nearly every fight. They were staples to my strength, and having them upgrade may have been the only reason I'd been able to fight on. You have upgraded a skill. Righteous Fury, Rare, Dash, Battle Fury, Epic. Momentum of the Avalanche, Rare, Dash, Weight of the Arctic, Epic. I'd been near dead at the end, barely on my feet and ready to fall from a strong breeze. Then the war leader had come. I was spent, mana sputtering, spirit wrung dry, laws nearly shot. And a massive orc war leader had roared in my face. Challenged me. It was something I couldn't leave unanswered, and thankfully, my skills, already pushed to the limit, gave way and upgraded, allowing me to push on. Battle Fury, Epic. Harness the fury of battle to obliterate your enemies. Righteous or otherwise, all fury is fuel for the heat of battle. Temporarily increase the effect of all stats by 35% at the cost of increased stamina and spirit consumption. Once the effect wears off, your body enters a state of weakness based on the duration of the boost. Weight of the Arctic, Epic. The weight of Arctic winds and frigid cold builds slowly. What may not be immediately threatening gathers over time relentlessly, leaving no room for reprieve. Harness that weight and express it in battle. Percentage boost to all physical attributes the longer you are in battle, capping at 125% after 3 hours. Both upgrades worked to push my stats even further. Fury went from a 22.5% boost to 35%, increasing by 12.5%. Avalanche went from a 100% boost over 2 hours to a 125% over 3. During the fight, Weight of the Arctic didn't activate retroactively. It didn't instantly boost my stats by 25% even though I had been fighting for over 3 hours. Unfortunate, but if it had happened that way, my body may have given out. I was already threading the needle with how much boost I was applying. Fury's upgrade did activate instantly, which was already a 12% bump. Another 25% may have broke me rather than helped me. Of the 6, I wasn't sure which I liked best. Armor proficiency was a rather subtle increase in my overall strength. It allowed me to wear even heavier and thicker armor while still moving like it was light. Ice manipulation had been a long time coming, and I was grateful for the final push. I hadn't tested it extensively, but I knew my range and skill had improved. Frost armor kept me safe through a number of difficult battles. Jotun's resistance outshined it somewhat in recent bouts, but the additional layer of protection was welcome. Mighty Blow was a staple. Both Shattering Hammer and Frozen Rift were more powerful, but as I just learned, relied on my hammer. Without it, Mighty Blow was all I was left with. Plus, it didn't have the tremendous cost as those two did. Its effect was most likely better in terms of cost alone. Fury. Starting out as the common ranked Barbarian's Rage, and it had come a long way. I still remembered first activating it and feeling my vision turn red in rage. It took practice in order to use the skill without losing myself mentally. It was that same practice that I recently ignored and allowed myself to let that fury back in. Maybe that was what pushed it further? Still, it was another that I'd upgraded all the way from common. From Barbarian's Rage to Barbarian's Fury. Then, Righteous Fury, and now to Epic Battle Fury. That skill had milestones in my life I didn't like to remember. My grandfather's death and the anger I stewed in was the initial inspiration to push it to uncommon. Then it was my father's death that pushed it to rare. Then, it was better left alone. The memories were still raw. Avalanche lacked those milestones and the novelty of starting from common rank. I received the skill at rare and it had been stuck there ever since. I'd lost count of the number of times I'd maxed it out fighting for well longer than 2 hours. When I first picked the skill, I thought 2 hours of fighting was an obscenely long time. Now it was rather common to fight long drawn-out battles. For pure enjoyment and remembering the journey, Meteor Strike was probably my favorite. It didn't have the inherent sadness of Fury, but was still with me from all the way back then. It was the first skill I'd picked. Bringing my thoughts back to the present was difficult. I wanted to stay in the past. I wasn't ready to deal with everything yet, but I had to. Now wasn't the time to languish in my head. I picked up yet another Fallen Order member and made my way back. The bodies were thinning out and I was nearly done. I wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. While the job of retrieving the dead was grim, it kept my hands busy. Chapter 287, Assessment Results. Chris POV. It was well into the night before the bodies in need of gathering ran out. There were more than I cared to count, but I knew someone already had. That someone had been pacing around waiting for me to call upon her. I didn't want to. I really didn't want to, but I had to. Sophia, I called. She perked up and stopped her pacing to come bounding over. Her eyes were tired, and I knew she hadn't slept in a while. Her endurance wasn't the same as mine, and she needed more rest than I did. Hell, I needed rest after the day I had, but I just couldn't bring myself to lie down. I didn't want to leave my mind alone to remember. How many? I said. My lord. I didn't even have the energy to groan, let alone correct her. The healers have stabilized who they can and the casualties should not increase. With that, I can report of the 841 who marched south, 315 were killed in action. A further 287 were seriously wounded, with the rest either moderately wounded or lightly wounded. 246 have lost either one or more limbs and require extensive further healing. But the most worrying thing right now is infection, Sophia reported. Infection? I asked. While people still occasionally got sick, those with enough levels behind them rarely did. I hadn't been sick since the change, my fortitude enough to ward away disease and my vitality enough to kill off anything that got by. Yes, the healers are saying that the orc blood isn't only corruptive, but can cause infection if left untreated. Many who ingested it or otherwise had it enter their bloodstream are growing sick quickly. Now that the worst of the wounded are either out of the woods or... She paused, leaving the or dead part unsaid. The healers are turning their focus to the infection. Is it serious? I asked. Yes. Some have already died because of it, she sadly informed. So it's fatal? That didn't sound good. Nearly everybody got the blood on them. Hell, I got covered in it. Only for the most susceptible. Those with heavy wounds or those at their healing limit can't fight it off as well as others, she said. My thoughts sped up for a moment. Is it spreading? Do we need to quarantine people? This was obviously a magical disease and I was unsure of the protocols of what we had to do. This was a first for us. The healers say they have it handled, but it will take a little while to address, Sophia said. That's good news. One of the few good things to come out of this test was the cooperation of healers. Nearly every healer, regardless of faction affiliation, came together to help as much as they could. It didn't matter if someone was from their faction or not, they did what they could to heal them. Most were in the medical field before and carried that practice over, but some weren't and did so anyway without being prompted. That cooperation led to a large company of healers working together, and with that much manpower behind it, I could rest without worrying about the disease. Another, well, it was hard to say positive thing, but with most of the deaths being not healers, the ratio of healers and patients dramatically changed. Our faction alone had under 15% healers. That number was closer to 25% now. All right, Sophia, is anything else pressing? My eyes were drooping and I knew I wouldn't be able to put off sleep again. It was calling and I had to answer. Nothing that can't wait, she said thankfully. Good. I'll catch up with you in the morning. We turned our separate ways and I mused over what she had said. 3:15. Over 300 of our people were dead. We had yet to get an overall death count, but that was bound to easily be in the tens of thousands, maybe even in the 100,000. From the whispers I picked up and the initial estimates while I was walking through the dead, factions were expecting 50%. That made our under 40% good, but I couldn't bring myself to feel that way. Laying down, I fought away the plaguing images by going over what I had to do the next day. Sophia would be first, as I needed to pick up the responsibilities of leading. Abigail would be next to take stock of my family. Marcus at some point to see how he and his fared. Then make preparations to leave. I missed home. It would take months to get back without the boats, but I kind of liked that part. No fighting, no battles, nothing except clean air and nature. Felt right. Then once we got back, crafting like mad. Maybe I can tinker along the way? Ding! The chime of a notification drew me from my slumber and I jumped up into a fighting stance at the alert. My blanket went flying and my bed smashed to pieces at the sudden force. Looking around and seeing nothing coming for me, I relaxed slightly. I'm a bit jumpy. I knew what it was. There could only be one thing it could be. I hadn't killed anything and I hadn't upgraded a skill or increased a law. Well, it could be a notification telling me my city was lost, but there was something a lot more probable instead. E-rank Planetary Protections Assessment complete. Results: 12 of 13 obelisks had successful defenses. Success conditions exceeded. Planetary protections against beings and factions above E-rank will continue. Rewards: defenders and factions who participated in the assessment will be able to redeem their rewards anytime for the next planetary rotation. Congratulations on your achievement. May your spirit never be extinguished. Yeah, it was what I thought it was. After reading the notification, a timer popped up behind it. 23 hours, 56 minutes, and 4 seconds. Great, 1 day to decide on what I need. From the way it was worded, I had individual rewards waiting for me along with faction rewards. Since I was the head of our faction, I had to choose those as well. One obvious thing was frost giant parts. That was non-negotiable. Other than time to level my profession, that was the last thing I needed to reach D rank. That was assuming frost giant parts were available, but I like to think they were. The only other time we'd experienced rewards, the options were endless. The tutorial reward store had nearly anything I could imagine. If this was anything like that, frost giant parts would be the least of my worries. It only mattered if I could afford them. I like to think I did a lot and earned enough contribution for plenty of purchasing power, but I wasn't sure how it all worked. No one was for that matter. For all I knew, this assessment wasn't worth much, and even if I defended against the orcs single-handedly, I wouldn't gain much. Now you're just being a pessimist, I thought. The difficulty was so high thousands died. I didn't instantly dive into the rewards as I wanted to talk to Abigail and Sophia first. Abigail because she would want to do the same thing as before and assign certain things for people to buy to help out the whole. She would especially want input on what I picked for our faction's rewards. Maybe we should coordinate with Marcus so we don't end up getting the same thing? People would undoubtedly pick what was best for themselves, that much was obvious, but we could stretch our rewards further by coordinating together. Instead of everyone with a water affinity buying a technique separately, wasting all of their points, one person buying it and sharing would allow for more things to be purchased. That was asking for a lot, and people would have to trust others to keep their word. Most wouldn't be willing to put something so important in someone else's hands, but we could still try. Those in the order would participate. They'd already received gains from this method, as the techniques they used to refine their bodies were from sharing our tutorial rewards. I can have Abigail and Sophia head that effort. They have just under 24 hours to organize it, which should be more than enough time. What came to mind after Frost Giant parts was runes. Runes were something I needed to expand my profession. I knew most were protection or durability runes, but I could always use more. The only problem was it felt like a waste to use my reward on that. Eventually, with our pylons upgrading and building a marketplace/trading hall, I believed we'd reach other planets for our store. Runes, while not as trivial as raw materials, was still something I believed I could eventually buy through my pylon. Rewards through the system itself were rare. It felt wasteful to use the rare chance on something I could purchase somewhere else. The materials from the tutorial reward store were different, as we needed those for immediate survival. Now, our city was set up and people were thriving. Immediate safety wasn't that big of a concern. Ow, wow. The pain of moving so abruptly caught up and racked my body. Reading over the notification and thinking over my initial thoughts didn't take long, and now it was catching up to me. I knew my body would be in pain, but this was something else. It was nearly as bad as after the demons, and I'd been blown up then. Having everything ache, hurt, or otherwise cause me pain was a repeating affair I wasn't proud of. "Chris, you need to get out here." A worried shout for my attention dragged me away from the pain. I still wasn't clothed, as I fell face first into bed wearing the same destroyed armor as before. Abigail had washed me off with her water after the fight. Luckily, but I still hadn't had the effort to change into something else. My chest was still bare and the armor covering my legs was in pieces, but I ran out of my tent anyway. I felt for my hammer but remembered it was gone. As I exited, ice flared, and with ice manipulation now at rare, it was faster and smoother than ever before. I went with an axe this time, as it didn't sound like I had the time to harden it sufficiently to make a hammer. What? What is it? Are we under attack? I yelled as I painfully rushed toward where the shouting came from. I knew wars would break out, but I hadn't thought people were so despicable to start right after what happened. That was more than just dishonorable to hit someone while they're down. Frozen patchwork was still active, as my wounds were still in need of healing, but I prepared myself to do battle as best I could. The thought of using fury or other boosting skills physically pained me, and I knew it would be a bad idea. Still, if it was required, I'd pay the consequences. Not being able to see a healer left the wounds covering me black and raw, but I had nearly a full mana pool now, even if my body wasn't in the best of shape. My anchor was still aching and my spirit wasn't fully back. But I had enough. I was ready to activate Glacial Heavy Plate, but instead of seeing people rushing to prepare for battle, I saw people clustered around staring toward the obelisk. Our camp was empty of everyone of fighting capability, and they were instead grouping up around what was left of the wall, trying to look over one another to get a better view of something. None were hastily putting on armor or reaching for weapons. People were staring with curiosity, not wariness. Seeing that there wasn't an immediate threat, I noticed that the sun was up rather high in the sky. I usually awoke near sunrise, but I'd overslept by a few hours apparently. It was near noon by my estimation. Without a handy timer to keep track, we were back with sun approximations. No one had seen it a priority to get watches working again. It was Abigail who had called for me, somehow looking a lot more put together than the day before, but even she was staring in the same direction as everyone else. People were noticeably trying not to crowd around her, and I was able to push through rather easily. We were still in our faction section after all, and most were scared of me. I stepped up next to her to look at what all the excitement was about and saw. What the fuck? Without the smoke of battle or the weather to block out the sun, clear sight of the obelisk from the destroyed wall was restored. Every tree between the two had been chopped down even before the battle. There, at the base of the obelisk, people were exiting. Nearly the same way as the orcs were disgorged from not even a day prior. Seeing people exit the obelisk, I was ready to yell out a call to arms, but something stopped me. Instinct or a gut reaction, I wasn't sure, but I felt like another battle wasn't imminent. By the fact no attacks were launched and no arrows or spells were flying through the air, I wasn't alone in that assessment as other factions flocked to the surprise similar to how we had. A flash of light and a limping Austin appeared next to me. He was still nursing similar injuries to my own and only one hand grasping his backup spear. His eyes flashed and faint wings unfurled behind him as he drew on his bloodline. That's a fucking dwarf. And that's an elf. My eyes saw their forms, but I couldn't see clearly enough to declare what race they were. But Austin definitely could. But why are they blue? Chapter 288. Straight to business. Volwyn POV. Volwyn stepped through the portal with only slight apprehension. This wasn't his first time traveling between planets, but it would be his first going so far. Usually, jumps between nearby planets only took a few moments. The distance wasn't that far considering. The distance between this new planet and Dervingard was much longer. Still, while longer than usual, it was much smoother than any jump he'd participated in. The Great System's assistance made it feel like gliding on ice rather than some of the more sketchy portals he'd been through. While traveling, he reviewed the information they had on the planet already. There wasn't much, as the Frost Rose Emporium was only headed by a high B rank. There was only so much they could do to scry through the Great System's protection. The layout was barebones, as they only had snapshots compared to real-time information. All the pylons that weren't veiled, which was all of them considering the humans didn't know how to hide them, at the time of the scrying was all they could manage along with pylon level. Volwyn doubted there had been any significant changes other than a few getting destroyed. They also knew the general layout of the planet, where the landmasses were and how large or small they were, but that much was basic. It would be hard to make headway if they were dropped in knowing nothing. Other than where the pylons were and what the land looked like, everything else was woefully unknown. They knew there were humans, but not what the political situation there was or what the power structure looked like. As an elf, he had studied the kingdoms of man to get a better understanding, but he wasn't sure how well that would serve him. The traditions and customs of frost elves were wildly different after all. Plus, those records were from established powers. This planet was full of first-generationers. They could have completely different customs than he was expecting. Not knowing the situation they were portaling into, Volwyn grasped his scant defensive treasures just in case. He hadn't been able to afford much, but a defensive treasure was a must-have. At least I don't have to ward against the atmosphere. When his vision finally focused, Volwyn saw death. So much death. He'd read stories, first-hand accounts written by those of the first generation during integrations. So he knew they were tested. Hell, everyone knew they were tested, but seeing it firsthand was different. The rest of his team appeared behind him and he heard groups from other trading companies as well. His team of 8 wasn't the only to appear in the field of death. There were no deserts near the obelisk they had chosen to portal to, so the Timeless Sands weren't one of them, but he recognized most of the other companies his compatriots were from. A smaller team from Grass Sea Trading Group, one from Clear Breeze Isles, another from 9 Rivers, one from Mountain Heart, and a few others he didn't recognize. Altogether, there were around 50 people standing around him staring out over the pockmarked, burned, and smoldering land. The bodies of the dead were orcs and they were strewn about in the thousands. Volwyn recognized the void sickness in them right away. The specific stench was something he would never forget. Subconsciously, he turned toward the Grass Sea Trading Group after seeing the dead. He and most others did as well, watching how they would react. Their company was similar to the Emporium in that it wasn't made up of solely one race, and among its members were several orcs, some of which were standing not 10 meters away looking at thousands of their own kind. They were of different denominations, as the orcs of the Grass Sea were taller and less hairy compared to the ones lying before them, but they were both still orcs. Demarkta, on orc spat to the side angrily, Kazaktrikanda. The other orcs replied with similar curses. Volwyn didn't need his skill to translate as he knew the curse. Succumbing to the void wasn't an honorable way to go, and orcs, one of the fiercest warrior races, detested it most of all. Most races saw it similarly. Not only did the person cease to be of sane mind or spirit, they forced others, sometimes friends or family, to end their lives. Dragons went out of their way to put down those of their kind who had been corrupted. A few orcs who were more sympathetic knelt and offered rites of passing, but most didn't join them, unwilling to bless those who had fallen to corruption. While most had an eye on how the orcs responded, they also noticed movement around them. All around them, the humans had built a wall surrounding the obelisk, and now that the merchant's appearance was noticed, they were all coming out to see what was going on. From what Volwyn could make out, a stream of void-touched had come from the obelisk, and the humans were forced to defend against it. From the smashed fortifications and sundered wall, it had been a hard-fought battle. From the amount of dead alone, Volwyn estimated that there had to be at least 100,000 or 200,000 defenders. Anything less, and they wouldn't have been able to survive without D-ranks. From reports, there were only a few on the planet, not nearly enough to stand against this without substantial help. The faces kept appearing up and around where the rubble was thickest. His vision clearly picked out looks of surprise and curiosity on most faces. Nearly every person he saw was injured in some fashion. "Well, Jekkas, let's meet the locals," he muttered. "Hello?" Volwyn announced loud enough for the gathered crowd to hear clearly. As a merchant, his translation ability was second to only a few others. "If you have a leader or leaders, if you could arrange a meeting for us, that would be most welcome." Most of the faces showed slight shock at being able to understand him, but none immediately rushed off or came forward. He was watching to see who was the decision-maker, but it seemed there wasn't one. Odd. Another team leader from a separate company tried again, using different words, but it had no different effect. Their words were only met with wary looks and estimating eyes of apprehension. The initial awe wore off, and some shuffling and shouts spread to those behind the wall that he couldn't see. But there was movement eventually. All the merchants stayed near the obelisk so as to not provoke an attack. They were severely outnumbered, and while they had a number of guards as a group, all of them knew they stood no chance against so many. Why did it have to be an army test? A man broke through the line of those gathered and approached from what Volwyn guessed was the south. They had maps, but he hadn't exactly been given ample opportunity to orient himself, and everything carried the same color of destruction. He wore simple armor, and it looked not entirely fitting, and he had a halberd in his hands. It wasn't pointed threateningly, but he still held it. As if the dam broke, others from other directions followed the man's lead. A remarkably dark woman near where the man with the halberd came out approached next. She reminded Volwyn of the rare dark elf he had seen, with a pleasing smattering of white freckles upon her face that stood out nicely compared to her midnight skin. From the west, a duo appeared walking out together. The woman wielded a mace encased in dense earth while the man's fist steamed slightly. The man was especially displeasing as he reeked of smoke and flame. The north had the most expensively dressed man and another person who reminded him of dark elves. The dark-skinned man set Volwyn on edge. He did not like the dark aura the man gave off. Death magics were forbidden on Dervingard. Lastly, the east had another duo. One was bare-chested with wounds on full display under a thin sheet of frost and an axe of ice in one hand. The man felt overwhelmingly like ice and smelled of home. The other was clothed in leather with a glaive that disappointedly lacked the same feeling. Other than those 8, a few more appeared as well. Another woman with the stench of fire and vibrant red hair. A man with 2 axes, along with other small groups. What began as a few people turned into a group roughly the size of his own coming out to meet him. All of the guards were on edge and, while not openly grasping weapons, were preparing in case their presence was needed. No central leader then, Volwyn thought. The humans approaching also didn't come with weapons pointed at them, but they were out, rather than sheathed. All of them were at or near level 100, just like they were. The D ranks mentioned in the reports must be elsewhere because Volwyn didn't see any. Not exactly the most diplomatic welcome, but considering we're standing upon a recent battlefield, it'll have to do. The man with the halberd spoke first. "Who are you?" After a quick look around and silent motions, they allowed the human leader from 9 Rivers to do the introductions. All of them had translation skills, so it didn't matter who took the lead. Maybe if they saw a fellow human, things would go smoother. "We are merchants sent here to establish trade on newly integrated planets such as yours," the 9 Rivers team leader said. "Now that you have passed your assessment, access has been granted for us to arrive and begin trade." A barebones explanation, but it did the job. "How?" It said we kept our protections against aliens. A man from one of the group clusters pointed out. Aliens was a rather harsh term. Hopefully they aren't xenophobic. Trade with xenophobic cultures is always needlessly difficult and usually not worth the effort. Not all monoracial planets were like that, but they tended to dislike outsiders. It was their nature. For generations, they grew up, lived, and died without seeing someone outside their race. An inherent fear or apprehension was normal. I'm not sure of the exact wording of what you were told, but your planet is now open to all at or under E rank who wish to make the trip. If they aren't sworn to a faction above that, of course. The human merchant responded before adding, "Besides us, what makes you special? Why do you get to come?" Said one native. "We won, but we still have to worry about invasion." "This is bullshit," another accused. Whoa, slow down and let me explain," the human merchant said. "We are special because we are merchants. Part of the contract for first rights forbids us from any and all pylon ownership, and we can only send a certain amount of people. You are at no risk of invasion from us as our contract makes it impossible. Secondly, only E-ranked factions or independent E-ranks are allowed to travel here, and that is easier said than done. Without the aid of the great system, like we had, the trip is ruinously expensive and no one but the desperate would waste the funds on such an endeavor." The explanation worked to mollify most, but there were still a few with skeptical looks. "Wait, you said you're merchants, right?" The one with expensive garments questioned. The embroidered lightning bolts were a nice touch. "Yes, we are." "Then you have the parts we need to evolve?" He clarified. "Not every possible creature or bloodline, but we have most available for purchase. Among other things." The merchant answered, concealing a sly grin. Getting right to business would break the ice and ease their arrival tremendously. The human trait, while fascinating in theory, was a massively profitable trade endeavor. Additionally, knowing they were being sent to a purely human world, all of them had prepared their goods accordingly. Even the most dull merchant stocked up on creature materials and other parts they could get their hands on. Except for the very rare and expensive or prohibited, all of the companies brought along an assortment of options. It was possible, once they were set up and established, to request other materials to be brought in, but that required funds that Volwyn doubted the natives had access to. "Do you have the blazing mane of a crimson lion? Do you have the hide of a shadow panther? Do you have—" The requests came in quickly, and the number of different parts requested grew with every shout. All were at the threshold to evolve, and it seemed like the last thing most were missing was parts. Volwyn and the other merchants concealed smiles. While it wasn't the most elegant or diplomatic entrance, getting straight to business had its own novelty. Chapter 289, Forgetting Something. Chris POV. "Marcus, did you know about this?" I asked as we watched the aliens receive a flood of requests. The initial surprise had worn off, and now I was just trying to wrap my head around real-life aliens. Austin was more than excited to meet them, but I had him stay back in case something happened. I didn't think it was likely, but it was best to be cautious. The books we had access to in the tutorial told us a lot, but we had to know they were out there in the first place to buy them. We didn't know being sent merchants was going to happen, and I was taken off guard. "No, I did not know aliens were going to show up," Marcus answered measuredly. "Both of us were among the first to approach, but we stayed our distance while everyone else closed in after hearing they might hold the last piece to evolve. If they'd broken out a stand and started showing wares, I might have been worried about first come first serve, but none of the merchants were doing that. They were only answering questions for right now and going on about what they would eventually have available. There was no active trading happening. I had to evaluate how my time was best spent. I could, like the others, shout out parts that those in my faction and family might need, but we had a timer ticking that was more important in my opinion. We had less than a day to finalize what we wanted as our reward. It's best to have Jonathan and the other merchants feel out the aliens. See what they have available, so we don't waste precious rewards from the system on something we could have bought anyway. Merchant skills played off one another well, and they were able to take stock of what was available a lot faster than anything I could do. They had specific skills for it like check inventory and exchange wares. I could tell Marcus wanted to get closer, but I had other plans. "Marcus, I'm going back, but can you come speak with me when you find the chance? It's not urgent, But before you pick your reward. Yeah, I can, he said. It was clear his attention was mainly on the newcomers, but his affirmation was enough for me. Instead of joining in the crowd, I went back to our camp. I was one of the few to leave. Abigail and Austin were in the same position I had left them in and were obviously curious as to what was going on. While Austin had incredible eyesight, his hearing couldn't reach that far. At least not yet. Abigail, is Jonathan in good enough shape to do some work? I asked. The last I saw the man, he was unconscious with worse wounds than me. He's not perfect, but Ashley saw him this morning to fight off the blight. He's still wounded, but not too badly, she answered. It was clear she didn't want him walking around, but he would have to anyway. Apparently, there are merchants sent here from other planets with aid from the system. I think this is its attempt to connect us to the outside universe. I summarized. We need to make the best use out of this before our time runs out. Abigail instantly caught on to what I was thinking. We can organize what we need most and check what we can buy from them instead of the system. That way we can make best use of our contribution points. As soon as she caught on, she started planning out the next steps before I could get a word in edgewise. Grace and Sophia will need to help along with a few others. It'll take a few hours to get to everyone and come up with a prioritized list. But we should be done before the timer is up. Hold on there, Austin cut in. I think you guys are forgetting something pretty important. At Austin's mention of forgetting something, Abigail's face scrunched up as she went back over everything in her head, but she didn't show any hint that she knew what he was talking about. I didn't know what he was talking about either. Come on, think about it. Seeing how we were missing something he already knew, he had a small smile on his face. We're given one day to pick or we lose the opportunity. I caught on and so did Abigail. Which means in one day, everyone here will have something worth stealing. Austin finished. Oh shit. It was going to be like when people first returned. Everyone had rewards from the tutorial and fights broke out trying to steal anything valuable. There were still over 100,000 people crammed near the obelisk. More living in the city across the river. Even if we could leave, we wouldn't make it very far in only one day, I said. We had too many wounded to move and not enough wagons to move them on. We had our bison and horses still, as they hadn't participated in the fighting, but we arrived by boat, not wagon. It would take more than a day to build everything needed to make traveling by land feasible. All of the builders who fled survived, and so did most that stayed behind to work the siege weapons. Getting them started on wagons would take at least a few days with the amount we needed. Plus, we'd need workers to go log the wood required. We weren't going anywhere fast. Do you think anyone will try anything after witnessing what Chris could do? Won't they be wary? Abigail questioned. Austin scoffed. You overestimate how smart people willing to steal are, but even if that were true, how many people do you think there are that saw him fight that still live? I lost sight of him barely an hour into the fight, and I doubt anyone else was paying much attention when they were too busy trying not to die. The Great Lakes Alliance faction leader did, Abigail rebutted. Okay, there's one faction that won't try it. What about the 100 others? So what do we do? I asked. Hole up in camp and wait? We'll need to leave eventually, and the longer we do, the more time it gives others to prepare ambushes. Everyone knows the direction we're leaving in. Everyone knew we arrived with Marcus and that our pylon was in the far north. We would leave in only one direction. There'll be chaos, but not as bad as you're probably imagining, Austin remarked. What? So it won't dissolve into people killing each other for treasure? I said. Oh no, there will be that, Austin waved a hand. But just not on the scale you're imagining. The number of people, let alone factions, that pose a threat to us is small. Even if they don't know how strong you personally are, Chris, we have nearly 500 people with us and Marcus has over 600. With a group of over 1,000 all traveling together, not many will try anything as there will be other, easier targets. Plus, you're forgetting that people will seek to protect what they already have before looking at what others possess. There will be a portion of people just looking to escape with the treasures they handpicked from the store rather than chancing losing it all on stealing something that might not help them. We will still have to make stronger preparations. Make the wagons stuttier and thicker just in case we are attacked. I said, It will take a little longer, but it will be worth it. Plus, more people on guard duty until we get far enough away. What about the cities we'll go through to resupply? We will have to go to Storm City or Verdant Falls to make it back to Twin City. We won't make it all the way without resupplying somewhere, Abigail said. Going to the faction capital of either the Heartlands Alliance or the Stormlands did not sound fun. Marcus wasn't technically at war with them, but they weren't friends, and I doubted they'd allow him to resupply in one of their cities. The Stormlands sounded equally bad as Nick was a prick. There's nothing that says you have to meet him. We could send people in to buy what we need and get out. Less than a day and we'd be on our way again. Abigail, read my face. There were other, smaller cities along the way, but we doubted they'd have enough supplies to give any away to us. 1,000 people needed a lot to survive, more than any small village or town could reasonably without being pillaged and left to starve. Okay, that's our plan for later. What about now? I asked. We still have the trenches and what's left of the wall. I feel we're fine there. How many people could fight right now if it came to it? I'm not sure. Sophia was in charge of those numbers. If I had to guess though, around 200. Abigail mused. I only got the one hand now, but I'm still good for a scrap. Austin chimed in. I felt comfortable being able to defend what we already had set up. It was being ambushed while we traveled that worried me more. The materials would be more spread out in a line, making it easier to hit hard and fast before making off with whatever they took. I and the rest of US would guard the most valuable goods, but we wouldn't be able to cover everything. All right, with immediate security taken care of, we need to get started on our list. I said, Abigail, get started with Grace and Sophia and give what you come up with to Jonathan. I'll talk to Marcus to see if he's interested. I'll handle Marcus, Austin said. We haven't chatted in a while. I paused. Are you saying that because you want to do it or because he's currently talking to the aliens and you want to see them? Austin hesitated. Can the answer be both? Fine, I sighed. You talk to Marcus and see if he's on board. Austin smiled for a moment before turning suspicious. Wait, if I'm doing that, what are you going to do? Something I really don't want to. I said, talk to other faction leaders. What? Why? Austin asked. You won't be able to convince them to pool resources. I'm not going to ask that. I said, I want to see what other people have already figured out. Tracy had people who figured out how to make a messaging stone or whatever she called it, and now that the test is over, I need to see what other factions have and are willing to sell. Oh, Austin perked up. How are you going to get them to part with their secrets? The scouting we had done wasn't just for show. We already know what some factions have. All I have to do is convince them that sharing is in their best interest. I said, Can I come with you instead? Austin asked. Watching you beat them up sounds like more fun. I won't be beating anyone up. I sighed at his eagerness. But you said dash. Yes, I know what I said, but I didn't mean through violence. With outside merchants now available, coins will be more valuable than ever. And we still have the mana crystals we brought along with us to trade. Not to mention from what the scouts gathered, no one has anything worth burning that bridge over. I stated, taking anything by force was reserved as a last resort and only to be used if the thing was of vital importance. With Tracy handing me a messaging stone with some dedicated time and effort, I believed we'd be able to reproduce it. Miles also said he was close to figuring it out on his own, too. Luckily, the man survived the bloodbath but was in rather rough shape. He'd be fine by the time we got back to Frostheim, but he wouldn't be doing any artificer work in the near future. Fine, Austin huffed. I'm gonna go talk to some aliens. And he was gone in a flash. Who are you going to approach first? Abigail asked. I'm not sure, I said. We already made deals with Marcus, so he was already out. Jayla from Mountainside seemed reasonable. Marcus said that the Great Lakes Alliance was already interested, and Ashton with his new prime minister is also an option. You read the same reports I did, Abigail commented. You know the Admiral has the most we stand to gain. I did know that. Having the most people in his faction allowed for a lot more advancements. Plus, nothing he'd done or said made it sound like he would be unwilling to come to an agreement, but I felt out of my depth when I pictured meeting with him. Not power-wise, I was confident in myself now more than ever, but scheming and negotiation-wise. "I'll build up to him," I said. "I'll start with the little fish first." Chapter 290, Securing Agreements. Chris POV. The choice of who to visit first wasn't that hard to decide upon. There were a few that I could start with that didn't worry me as much as others, but I decided to start with one I was most personally interested in. I'd spoken to her only briefly, and while her city wasn't as immediately close as Ashton's was, she could still be considered a neighbor. It helped we had already started talks along these lines through messages. Now all we had to do was finalize it. Mountainside was around 2 months away by caravan. We hadn't made the trip, and that time wasn't confirmed, but from what we knew of the area and from maps, our estimate was 2 months. Marcus and the twins were closer, but we didn't have a whole lot of options when we looked at our trade opportunities. At least not until river travel opened up. Then we would be flush with choice. Jayla's camp was in a similar state to our own. It was still intact and had minimal damage, but instead of mostly canvas or leather tents set up, it was mostly earthen constructs. After arriving, I was met with a few people who stopped me and asked what I was there for. The guards still looked battle-worn but had no obvious wounds showing. Either already healed or they made it out better than the average soldier. Unfortunately, or rather quite predictably, Jayla wasn't there. She was still out near the obelisk dealing with the arrival of the merchants. I had to wait for an audience, but I saw someone from her camp run off to get her. While I had delegated the task of probing the merchants for information and gaining intel on what they had for sale, most others did not. Looking back, that should have been rather obvious. As I walked away, there were only a few others who had followed my lead or had ideas similar to my own. Still, waiting gave me the chance to go over what I was about to negotiate for. Mountainside, while close, wasn't that high on our list of priorities to gain favorable trades for at this moment. Sure, eventually we would want something running between our cities, but she didn't have the same advantages as trading with someone like the Admiral. The information we had didn't say they had anything vital that we needed. They had surplus food, a great deal of high-grade stone, and vast metals they pulled from the mountain, but nothing that we couldn't gain on our own. Not like some other pylons. Still, creating this connection would help our city develop, and she was an entry into my next stop, which held things that were of greater importance that I wished to acquire. It would also open us up to a market with a few more dungeons. Skills shards and other rare drops were still infrequent, but as time went on and dungeons expanded, we would see more of them. Expanding our reach now would make it easier later. It was some time before Jayla returned, and I was let in to meet with her. Her tent was worlds different than my own. It wasn't even really a tent. Felt like a bunker. It was made entirely of hard-packed earth to the point it was nearly as hard as stone, and the inside was decorated sparsely. Most everything was made of rock or stone, with only a few things not of the earth. Fur blankets and cloth accessories were one of the few. Jayla sat upon a chair made of stone and at a table raised from the ground. It was similar to what I could do with my ice, but she didn't have to continually infuse it with mana to keep it from melting, as she could let go once the stone was in shape and supported. Jonathan had done similar things in his and Abigail's tent. Her face was tired, and I knew my own held a similar expression. While I had slept, it hadn't been near enough. "Christopher, have you come to finalize our agreement?" She started and got straight to the point. "I'm glad I started here first." "I have," I said, and sat at the chair across from her. "The details still need to be finalized, and with everyone most likely making quick exits in the next day, time is not on my side." Jayla nodded at that. "Good. I feel the same. We've discussed the idea of trade and are both agreeable, but not specific goods." "No, we haven't," I answered. "I hear word of the occasional high-grade metal you mine that would be beneficial to my city along with other rare gems. And you want these high-grade metals and gems that I pull out of the mountain to make strong equipment, I presume?" "That, among other things," I said. "What would you like in return?" "Before we get into that, I feel we should agree on 2 things first." She said. 1. Trade permissions that allow any merchant under my banner to enter your city. You may still charge them an entry fee and tax them on their transactions, but nothing above the standard rate. I will do the same for any merchants of yours, but this does not extend to trade beyond my borders. Free trade without any additional tariffs? Fair enough. Agreed. And the second? A non-aggression agreement. Neither one of us will declare war or engage in hostilities with the other while this agreement is in effect. Another request easily granted. Unless Mountainside attacked first, I had no plans to go to war with them. A defensive alliance would have been a hard no, but non-aggression was fine. Agreed. Now, what is it you want for your metals and gems? A percentage of the equipment made from it to offered back to us, before selling to others, along with a discount on such equipment. She said, holding up one finger. The first ask was doable and not that hard to comply with. Along with a road. A road? I was surprised by the request. Yes, a road. Whether only financed or instead built by your own men, it matters not. I have plenty of earth mages and masons that are up to the task if you have the coin to pay them. Her smile was a touch predatory at offering her city's services in that regard. Priority trade on the equipment we make from her material, favorable deals on such equipment, and a road. Two were obvious and not that difficult to comply with, but the third threw me at first. Anything else? No, that should do it. In return, in addition to rare metals and gems, I'll throw in something else. Her eyes sharpened. I hear you have several citizens taking after avian bloodlines, yes? Austin, Hal, and my mother came to mind. My mother hadn't gotten one yet, unlike Gabriel, but high-grade wind bloodlines were almost always avian. I nodded. Yes, I have a few with avian bloodlines. My mountains hold more than riches. We haven't spotted any drakes or wyverns, but we have seen giant eagles and griffins, she said. While parts will be scarce as everyone rushes to evolve, sightings will not be. Information on specific bloodlines you need is what I offer in addition to what we already agreed upon. How does that sound? The road was going to be expensive, time-consuming, and take away from other projects we could be doing, but it would eventually be a net positive. With the bloodlines and parts as the kicker, it was a hard deal to refuse. I am agreeable. Then so it shall be. She held out her hand and we shook. I remained seated and she looked at me expectantly. You arrived and fought with the leader of Yellowstone, Travis, if I recall? I did. Would you introduce us? Off to secure more metals for the forge? She commented. Sure. I can introduce you to Travis. I remained silent. Sourcing more metal was a reason I was meeting with him, but not the primary one. Frostheim, while great in many ways, was also lacking in many ways. We set down roots in a place with no previous infrastructure or industry. We had prepared for that and brought along seeds for farming, but we still lacked certain things. Without that previous industry, even though most of it had been destroyed, we were still behind. Yellowstone's most precious resource for us right now wasn't metal. It was something more basic than that. You want cattle? Travis sounded surprised. More than surprised, actually. He must have been expecting me to ask for what everyone else was asking of him, metal and minerals. But that wasn't what we needed. We pulled enough out of the dungeon for our needs. We could use more, but other things were more important. Cattle was one of them. Yes. A sizable herd along with a few ranchers to teach their craft. I reiterated. We had a few ranchers among our city already, but they were horse ranchers. Their skills were all in regards to rearing and taking care of horses, not cattle. The main reason we needed cattle was for food. We made do with hunters, but as we grew, meat became less and less available. We had chickens and people took up chicken farming, but outside of that, most of our meat relied on hunters. The town we had assimilated after passing through it, where we picked up Elliot, brought pigs along with them, but there weren't enough for an entire city. Even with their reproduction increasing, it still wasn't enough to feed thousands. Cattle would also give us access to milk and cheese, another area we were deficient in. Dairy cows and meat cows. Two things that the ranchers of Montana or now Yellowstone could give to us. There was another faction I would be going to with a similar request. The reservation. Instead of cattle and cattle ranchers, my ask would be sheep and shepherds. Cotton did not grow in the far north. Other than a rough flax, we were left with leather and fur as our options for clothing and textiles. Wool would go a long way. Finalizing the deal for cattle was rather easy, and I even managed to secure a small amount of metals. Not anything overly large, but enough to boost our supply. After Travis and Yellowstone, I went to the reservation. After securing sheep, I went to the Great Lakes Alliance. I was slowly making my way around our closest neighbors, starting with Jayla in the west, Yellowstone and the reservation in the southwest, and now the Great Lakes Alliance in the south. Patrick already showed interest, and the deal with them was rather simple. Fish, aquatic resources, along with access to aquatic bloodline materials, in return for money and crystals. I also secured a bit more grain from him. With the crystal mine in full swing, we were pulling enough out of it that using them in trade was possible. Our needs for them were being met, and we had some left over. I was even able to make Patrick agree to a reduced tax on trade through his future ports. The lakes, while still a danger zone that held deadly aquatic beasts, would eventually turn into a hub of trade. It was nice to get an agreement set in place now. The man was oddly agreeable. We already had deals in place with Ashton, and I didn't want to deal with the new leader he pled allegiance to. It would be some time before they found routes around the forest that separated us anyway, and with everyone else I had made agreements with, I didn't need anything from him. The person I saved for last was the Admiral. He didn't have any raw resources we wanted, but information. From our scouts, we knew they had a long-distance way to communicate we needed to get our hands on. It wasn't to the point I would fight him over it, not after Tracy handing me a way around it, but it was still something I wanted to take a look at. Compare the two and see if Miles, Gabriel, or I could fuse into something better. Additionally, they had designs for ships that we didn't have and would be a step ahead of what we could produce. We knew that they already had seaworthy vessels going up and down the coast. Schematics on how they accomplished that would be a great head start when we needed to start designing our own for river or lake travel. Eventually, the ocean. The Hudson Bay wasn't that far away. We were still years away from being able to traverse the oceans, and we were totally ignorant of what dangers we'd run into, but it was something we would plan for eventually. Maybe not in this decade, but maybe the next. Lastly, they held the most up-to-date research on Magitech. I wasn't sure how close they were to cars or other electronics, but we had seen them using devices that we did not have. Communication, ship advancements, and Magitech. 3 important advancements I needed to secure.